If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What is the eeriest, most frightening paranormal entity or supernatural experience you've ever encountered? Something you'd never want to go through again in your life?
My name is Maco, and I've lived on and around the Menominee Indian Reservation located in Wisconsin, 1 hour north of Green Bay, for 27 years now. I have been a Leo in Menominee County for just about 3 years. This story happened to me in 2009, when I was a sophomore in high school. I was working out and playing basketball at a facility called the Family Center in Bowler, Wisconsin, which is 25 minutes from the reservation. I was with my friends James, Aaron, and Aaron's girlfriend at the time, Andy. We stayed working out till the later evening of around 11 p.m. maybe. We were coming back home on a road called CTHVV West, which connects the neighboring county to the reservation. As we came near the reservation line, all four of us observed what appeared to be a smaller individual walking in the opposite direction, away from the reservation. As we got closer, I observed the female wearing what appeared to be camo from the military. She also had a hood covering her face with a camo hat on. We got 10 feet from her and slowed down to see if she was okay, and when we rolled the windows down, all four of us, later determined, observed the female snap her head toward us in a quick motion. The female had no facial features, so we became frightened and sped off. We got maybe 30 yards down the road and turned the car around. Where the female was standing, there was a swamp on both sides of the road, which means she couldn't have gone there without us hearing her, but she had vanished. We all didn't know what to think but eventually chalked it up to the supernatural. 11 years later, I bring that story up to my sergeant on duty, and he has a puzzled look on his face and has me describe exactly where this incident occurred. I explained to him in detail, and he could not believe it because years past there was an incident with a sheriff deputy on the same road in the same area, with the deputy seeing what he thought was a male walking around the same area, and he stopped to check on him, and the male turned toward him, and he also did not have any facial features. The deputy did not stick around and just sped off. I thought it was incredibly strange those two incidents happened in the same area. My mom told me this. As a child, 2 to 3 years old, I played a lot by myself. Usually in the hallway between my mother's room and the bathroom. My mother was so surprised about my linguistic abilities. I was talking so well, but what freaked her out was she would hear me say a word wrong and then say, "Oh, okay," then correct myself. When we went to the video store, I always wanted to watch Crocodile Dundee. My family made fun of it, saying that I had a thing for accents and was born to live in Australia, just joking around with each other. One day my mom had enough of that movie and asked me why I loved it so much. I told her, they were like the man in the bathtub. My mother freaked out. You see, our apartment building was an old converted Victorian. Our bathroom was one of the first installed in our town, and the original tub was claw-footed, abnormally long, and always icy cold. When my mother moved in, she commented that it was big enough to float in. The manager said it had been a custom-made tub for the owner, who had been quite tall. The original owner had been Australian. I explained that he sat in the tub, and we talked. My mother made me play in the living room only. We moved out as soon as the lease ended. The Haunted Cabin. There was a man named Robert Albert who was in his 20s during the 1970s. This is when his friend, Rick Wolf, thought he should settle down and buy a house. The house Rick was interested in was built during the Civil War and had been renovated only a few times, so it had electricity and running water. Rick had asked Robert to go with him to check out the house, and since he was the only one interested in it, the previous owner gave him the spare key. So Robert and the friend hoping to buy the house got out of work and met up in the evening to go check out the house. This was their first big mistake. They wanted to see it at night. Their next big mistake was only bringing one flashlight. So the friend unlocks the door and then remembers to notify Robert about the rumors of it being haunted. Neither one was scared, but they still locked the door behind them as they entered. Important to note. They turned on the lights, which flickered a bit, but this was normal for a house with old wiring. So rather than checking out the bedrooms, the friend is intrigued with the thought of seeing the basement. So the two enter the basement and turn on the lights as they walk down the 3 to 5 steps that were leading down into the basement. As both walk around the basement, they are fairly content and decide to head back to see the rest of the house. As they turn, the lights flicker and then go completely out. Rick starts to panic, but Robert remains calm. "Robert, turn on the flashlight, you idiot." Rick, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I just got spooked." Rick grabs the flashlight and turns it on, thinking that the electricity just went out, feeling a bit more relieved. Then, their flashlight, whose batteries had been replaced that day, went out. They got more panicked and tried to search for the stone steps that led to the door out. As they were searching for the stairs, they heard a loud noise at the door, as if someone were attempting to come in. They got a bit more scared now, as per usual, and then heard even louder noises. As they felt the vibration of the locked front door being swung open, never hearing it close again. They heard heavy footsteps making the sound as if there was a thud, 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 and finally reached the stairs. As they felt the doorknob, they heard the footsteps stop at the basement door. Rick scrambled up the stairs, now behind Robert, as he shouted, "I'm sorry if we aren't allowed to be here. I have the spare key, it was given to me by the person selling the house." They hear heavy breathing that is uneven, then it just stops. They decide to open the door, and standing before them is nothing, and the door was still locked. Spooky local story based on a true story. The Maco light, also called the ghost at Maco Station, is one of North Carolina's most well-known and enduring supernatural phenomena. It dates to a fatal train wreck in 1867 at a small rural station then called Farmers Turnout, 14 miles west of Wilmington on the line serving Wilmington, Florence, South Carolina, and Augusta, Georgia. Conductor Joe Baldwin, riding in the last car of a wood-burning train, discovered that his car had come uncoupled. He died waving a lantern from the rear of that car in a failed attempt to signal and stop a second train coming from behind. One witness saw Baldwin's lantern fly clear of the train wreck, land and right itself in the adjacent swamp, and burn on. Shortly afterward and for over a century since, a flickering light has appeared regularly along the railroad tracks in the vicinity of the 1867 collision. Legend attributes this light to the ghost of Joe Baldwin, who was decapitated in the wreck. The ghost is said to be looking for its head. From 1873 until after an 1886 earthquake, railroad workers reported a pair of Maco lights that would appear together. Over the years, the Maco light has been bright enough to fool many railroad workers into stopping their trains. To remedy the ghost's schedule thwarting attempts, signalmen at Maco used two lights, one red and one green. While President Grover Cleveland's train was wooding and watering up at Maco in 1889, the president saw the two signal lights, asked about them, and got the full story of old Joe Baldwin. In the spring of 1964, the Southeastern North Carolina Beach Association contacted parapsychologist and ghost hunter Hans Holzer to come to Maco and investigate the mysterious light. After his visit, Holzer gave an apparent certification of the phantom conductor, citing the consistency of his return appearances. Since the railroad tracks were removed around 1980, sightings of the Maco light have greatly diminished, if not completely disappeared, according to Cape Fear Museum historian Harry Warren. In its time, the Maco light has been the object of many a dark vigil at Maco Station, where anywhere from a few to dozens of people would frequently gather at night. It has also been the subject of numerous newspaper stories and at least one narrative ballad, The Maco Light, which sums up the tale. They found Joe's body. They found Joe's head. They buried him both, but he's not dead. On a dismal night in a swamp, you can see his lantern shine. The Ghost of Oxford Milford Road. When Brad Culp was a student at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, there was a rumor that the town was one of the most haunted places in America. When Culp started an on-campus magazine, he couldn't wait to write about several of the area's most famous myths. Not long after his story was published, though, he kept finding himself thinking about one ghost in particular, the Ghost of Oxford Milford Road. As the story goes, many decades ago, probably sometime in the 1940s, there was a young man courting a young woman in a rural part of town. Because the woman's parents didn't approve of the match, each night he visited under the cover of darkness. After her parents went to bed, the young woman would sneak out of her farmhouse and flash the lights of her parents' car 3 times. Then her young suitor would ride his motorcycle down the road. One night he took the turn right before her house a little too sharp, says Culp. The motorcycle went one way, he went the other. His injuries were so severe that he did not survive. Rumor has it, however, that his love-struck ghost still haunts this stretch of Milford Road. Curious, Culp, his girlfriend, now his wife, and a friend decided to head out there one night to see if they could verify the tale. His girlfriend was worried she'd be completely freaked out. She believes more in that stuff than I do, Culp says. But he was mostly concerned that his suspicions, that none of this was actually true, would be confirmed. On this particular night, as Culp passed the abandoned farm, an idea came to him, and he pitched it to his girlfriend. How could she not say yes? Though reluctant, she relented, and Culp turned a short way into the farmhouse driveway. He killed the engine and flashed his lights 3 times. No joke, there was a single headlight that appeared 3/4 of a mile down the road, Culp says. You saw it start to come, going pretty slow. It kept coming and coming. My wife was freaking out. It was coming closer and closer. As a collision seemed imminent, Culp turned on his car's lights. He expected to see a kid on a bike, bailing out from his prank now that he'd been caught. But there's nothing there. The light is just gone, he says. They got out of the car. They walked around, trying to figure out what it was they could have seen. To this day, we still talk about it. I saw something I cannot explain, he says. If you get him and his wife around a campfire, they'll swear up and down that the story is true. And if you're ever in Oxford, Ohio, consider parking for just a few minutes on Oxford-Milford Road at night to test your own nerve. Me and my buddy were riding home through the woods in Alabama. We were going down a rural patch of road on an old highway. We had been hunting that morning, and we didn't end up killing a deer, so we decided to fish and grab some food. The morning hunt felt strange, as if I were being watched in the woods. I'm a police officer and retired Marine, so I don't get spooked easily. A pack of wild dogs ran through where my stand was. I kept feeling that burning feeling of being watched. It prompted me to leave early. The dark woods of Alabama are a scary place. After the hunt, we fished at the pond for a while before returning home. On the way home, we ran into something I have struggled with since that day. It was exactly 12 noon when we saw it. Before I get into the incident, you need to know some history about Baldwin Company, Alabama. The Battle of Blackley was fought along this particular highway. This battle was a bloody onslaught that occurred at the end of the Civil War and resulted in immense casualties. Now, on to what happened. We were around mile marker 18, and to the right, there it was. On a grassy embankment, in a curve in a road, just past an old bridge that we passed stood a tall black horse with a rider wearing black armor. It had black gloves gripping his horn of the saddle with a sword sheathed. This dark rider was massive in figure and missing his head. You heard me right, a headless horseman. The horse was abnormally large and was darker than night. The rider stoically sat in his saddle, facing the road as if he were waiting on something as we drove past. Now I don't spook easily, and my buddy doesn't believe in that kind of thing. As we passed the horseman, time seemed to slow down as I sucked in every detail. I remember everything about it. My buddy also stared in disbelief as we seemed to glide past in the safety of the truck, like some sort of safari from hell. Now here is where it gets weird. So when we passed it, I looked back in the mirrors and poof. Just like that, it was gone. This area was rural, the horseman could not have come from anywhere or been headed anywhere that fast. My friend told me shortly after that he didn't want to speak about it again. He was shaken up about it. It wasn't until later that he accounted for his story, and we saw the same thing. All up until we passed the horseman. His account was that the horseman was on the left side of the road and slowly walked into the center of the road and disappeared. I saw him clear as day on the right side of the road. Has anyone else seen him? Please let me know. So this happened when I was in 7th grade, right before me and my family were about to move. I lived in a duplex with my parents and younger siblings, and at this time we had all of our last few pieces of furniture packed, and at that point in my room we didn't have a bed, so we laid on the ground with the mat that we were going to sleep on. It's nighttime, and me and my siblings are all on our tablets, and the way we were positioned is that our feet were facing the door, and I'm the one who is closest to the door. The hallway lights are on, and my dad is watching TV in the living room, and my mom is at work. My dad isn't the type to check up on us unless we're being super loud. So at this point, me and my siblings are playing on your tablets and talking, and all of a sudden I decided to look up. When I look up, my whole entire body freezes, and I feel the hairs in my neck stand, and my blood runs cold. I see a dark figure, pitch black, looking at me, and I know it wasn't my dad because this figure had no facial features, it was just pitch black. Even though the figure had features I could make out at the time me and IT made eye contact and held that eye contact, it felt like an eternity before I blinked and it disappeared. I didn't tell any of my siblings about it when I saw it until it was a few days after we moved into our new house because somehow I felt like if I spoke about it earlier it would follow us. The time I saw a shadow figure and it saw me. It was a nice sunny summer day, and I was bored as my fiancé was at work. He would be home in a few hours, so I decided to visit a busy local park and walk the trails, which I often did to pass the time. At the time, I was around 18 or 19. In retrospect, I should have never been walking at the park alone, but I had done it so many times and nothing bad had ever happened before. I know, right? So naive, or maybe just plain stupid. Anyway, I arrived at the park, and I started my walk along the trail. I was walking for a few minutes and was about to enter an area of the trail that went through a bit of woods. As I approached the trees, I heard some leaves rustling and saw some small birds pecking at the ground. I kept walking for a few minutes, getting deeper into the wooded area, and I heard the leaves rustling again. I look over into the trees, expecting to see another bird or maybe a squirrel. When I looked over, I didn't see a squirrel or a bird or anything of the sort. What I saw, I could not comprehend. I saw a shadow, not see through like a ghost, and not lay out on the ground like an actual shadow. This shadow figure was pitch black and stood upright. It was shaped like a taller man but had no face. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, no ears, nothing. Just a shadow of the outline of a man's body. It was like my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. I grabbed my pepper spray, hoping this was just a human and my mind was only playing tricks on me and I could possibly defend myself from whoever this creep was. However, I quickly realized the sun was shining right through the trees. I surely would have been able to see some features, clothes, eyes, hair, something. Nope, nothing. I was frozen looking at this thing, realizing that it could definitely not be human. I started slowly walking forward, and as soon as I picked my leg up, it was as if I was looking in a mirror, only it wasn't my reflection. It moved with me at the same exact moment. I thought I was going crazy and turned slowly to walk the other way, curious, keeping my eyes locked on it. It did the same, without any hesitation. Halfway pooping my pants, yet still curious, I turned around again and started walking the other way, faster this time. Sure enough, it did the same. I turned to face it, it did the same. I stopped, frozen in fear, just staring at it. It stopped as well, staring right back. There we were. My shadow person and I were just staring at each other for what felt like an hour. In reality, it was just a few seconds. What happened next made me feel like I was in a freaking horror movie. It lifted its hand and very slowly waved at me. I felt the biggest wave of fear rush over me. Curiosity wasn't going to kill this cat. I booked it back in the direction I came from. I felt like I was running 1,000,000 miles a minute. My heart was in my toes, and I kept looking back as I was running to make sure it wasn't following me. I just kept going until I reached the busy basketball courts. I sat there for a while until I calmed down enough to drive home. I got home safely and have never seen that thing again. It was the only thing I could think about for months after. I tried to research what it could have been but to no avail. The closest thing I could find was Hat Man, and that wasn't it. Only after did I think about the fact that the park I was at is a memorial park of a Blue Angels captain who had passed away in an aviation accident nearby. It makes me wonder if maybe that was him, waving at me from beyond this realm. After all, the captain was a tall man with the same kind of build as that shadow. But the question is, why? I don't know, and I don't believe I ever will know, but I am okay with that. But what I do know is that I will never go walking trails alone again, no matter how busy or safe the area may be. This paranormal experience is not one that personally happened to me but to my family, my grandmother, grandfather, mom, uncle, and aunt, when they were younger, long before I was born. Some background information about my family. My grandmother is a full-blooded Native American, so I've always heard warnings about the paranormal and supernatural from both my mother and grandmother and usually brushed it off as silly superstition. Then, as I got older, I had a newfound interest in the paranormal. That's when I decided to ask my grandmother if she believed in haunted houses. She slowly looked at me and told me, "Oh yes, we used to live in one when your mother was a child." Now my interest peaked. "Could you tell me more?" I asked. She cleared her throat. "Well, let me tell you a history of the house first." She told me that the house had originally been a parish for a minister and his family. They had conducted funerals in the basement there since they didn't have a church. Soon the minister's two sons started acting strange, out of character. They became rebellious. Soon after that, the minister acted strange. He became rude and started drinking. That's when my grandmother's father fired him, and they moved out. Fast forward quite a few years, my grandfather had received his degree to be a minister, so he, my grandmother, mom, uncle, and aunt moved into that very same house. My grandmother said it started with small things, such as lights going out or the TV turning off by themselves, which they chalked up to bad wiring. My grandmother then told me that my aunt, the youngest of the 3 children, started getting sick a lot and acting strange. They still didn't really think it was paranormal or anything to do with the house. Then one night, when everyone was in bed asleep, my grandmother said the kitchen sink turned on. She said she proceeded to go downstairs to see who was up, but when she got to the bottom of the stairs, it had stopped. Thinking it was her imagination, she went back to bed. 2 events caused my grandparents to make the decision to have the house blessed and move out. When my uncle, the middle child who was about 5 at the time, told my grandmother that he saw a figure of a man standing in the hallway. He thought it was my grandfather, so he got out of bed and followed the figure down the stairs. When he got to the living room, the figure disappeared. Then one night the sink came on again. My grandmother went downstairs to shut it off. This time it was still on as she reached the living room. As she was about to enter, she said she saw her mother, who had passed some time before this. She told my grandmother not to enter the kitchen because he was evil. The next day, my grandmother and grandfather went to see her father, who was in the hospital. She told him about everything. He told them to 1. Have the house blessed, and 2. Take only their belongings and get out of that house. So they went back and had the house blessed and cleansed. The man who did the cleansing went to the basement. When he came up out of the basement, he was white as a sheet. Now mind you, he was full native as well. He then proceeded to tell my grandparents that an evil entity was there and was after my aunt. He then smuggled everyone and fought off the evil entity. My grandmother told me that when my aunt was smuggled, she turned red, got very hot, and smoke started coming off of her body as if she were on fire. Then it all stopped. She said there was a shift to the air after that. They stayed only one more night. They loaded up their belongings and left the next day. She said the house had since been torn down. It still gives me chills to think about it. Walking from my friend's house to my tent in NH one night to grab clothes, it was really dark. While doing so, I was about to turn around. I couldn't see my tent, it was so dark. When I glanced back at my tent to try and see it one more time, I noticed what looked like a beam of light by my ankles heading towards my now visible tent. I figured it was the moon. I felt like a child and balanced in it while walking, when all of a sudden the worst feeling I have ever felt washed over me. It felt like something powerful swung over me to stop me in my tracks, and I got the instant feeling to look up instead of keeping my eyes on my feet. I looked up, there was something 3 to 4 feet tall standing up, gray, like an alien humanoid thing right next to my tent. I froze and said, "Oh God, Ohio no." As it took 2 steps towards me, and once I said that, I ran frickin' fast inside the house. When I swung the door open, nobody noticed I flew into the house even though they were right in front of me. When I came home that weekend, I lost a lot of weight in the weeks to come. It wasn't a deer, I know what I saw, but I don't know what I saw. The feeling that came over me was so horrible, almost as if everyone in my family all died at once. Humanoid in the corner. So this happened 3 years ago when I was visiting my family in Arizona with my mom. We were staying at my sister and her husband's new home. It was a fairly large and up-to-date house. There were 2 floors. The room I was staying in was upstairs, and my mom's was downstairs. Since the home was new, there wasn't a lot of furniture. My room consisted of a small mattress in the far corner and had 2 doors on each side of the opposite corner. One led into an empty walk-in closet, and the other was the exit to the hallway. It was quiet and had a single window that didn't bring in much sunlight. Now I'm the type of person that likes to sleep with some kind of light on because I don't like complete darkness, but the room only had the ceiling fan light. I decided I was going to sleep in the dark and play Netflix or YouTube videos on my phone for a source of light so that I could fall asleep. Everything was excellent except when it was nighttime. I always felt a little creeped out when I went to sleep, but I just blamed it on me being afraid of the dark. Still, I couldn't shake that eerie feeling I had whenever I was within the room. About a few days in, I did my normal routine of getting ready for bed and then putting something on my phone to watch. As I was drifting off to sleep, I had this odd feeling I was being watched, so I kept looking up from my screen and scanning the room, but there wasn't anything around. I finally fell asleep, but then woke up abruptly. I figured it was really early in the morning, so I checked my phone to see the time, and it was exactly 3 a.m. I was kind of freaked out, so I turned around to look in the room. My heart sank, and I felt that pain that sears through your body when something instantly terrifies you. In the corner, I see this tall, dark figure. The room was already pitch black, but this humanoid thing was somehow even blacker than the darkness itself. I could see the outline, it was as tall as the ceiling and had a slim figure. I remember the hands were so large with long, skinny fingers. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it staring at me, unmoving. Man, it makes me tear up thinking about it, not because I'm going to cry, but because it was such an intense fear that I don't feel often. The weird part about it, though, is that I didn't scream or anything. I knew it wasn't human, and I don't know how to explain it, it's just that reacting felt pointless. It was standing in the corner between the 2 doors, so escaping wasn't an option either. I just quickly turned around and put the covers over my head. Then I turned on the first video on YouTube and started praying. It felt like I blinked because then it was suddenly morning. The sun was peering into my room. I turned my head to look at the corner and saw that there was nothing. Relief washed over me as I figured it was just a dream or some type of sleep paralysis. Except for, when I unlocked my phone, YouTube appeared with the replay button on the same video I clicked when I was hiding under the covers. The fear came back as I realized that it actually happened to some extent. My sister came into my room with her 2 dogs to say good morning and told me to get ready for the day we had planned. I started getting ready with the door open, and the dogs were in the room with me. They both went to the closed closet door and started whining and scratching at it. That really started to freak me out, so I opened it and peeked inside with my friend on the phone because I was about to pee my pants. There was nothing in there, just an empty closet. I went downstairs to eat breakfast and told my family about it. They thought it was creepy, but just shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. My sister said sometimes the dogs would do that to closed doors in that house, but honestly, I felt like they sensed something. I did actually keep sleeping in that room, though. Nothing more happened, and I kept the ceiling light on for a little while at night. It just kind of weirds me out thinking back because I fell asleep so fast after being scared like that, and then it felt like I blinked one moment and it was morning. My family jokes about me being abducted by aliens. But honestly, sometimes I wonder. A family experience with the supernatural. So this is a personal experience. There is some evidence to enforce the validity, as well as multiple witnesses of certain events. I will give a relatively brief idea as to what happened. I was a newborn at the time, so to get specifics, I need to talk to my family. In the late 80s, Liz and Corey, my parents, decided to buy a duplex in Crown Point, Indiana, and turn it into their future home. The home was located just off the downtown area of Crown Point, across from what was the YMCA. It is a quiet area. So this was going to be an involved remodel, so they emptied the house. They note that the basement was completely empty except for a room that had a chest in it. Remember this chest? Now it is important. They would decide to store all extra items at my grandmother's house. This included the chest. The house belonged to a veteran before they moved in. This chest was full of World War II memorabilia, medals, pictures, and clothing. So they made this duplex into their home. This was where they were going to raise the family. They had a young daughter and just had a new son, me, and they also have a border collie named Buckshot. My father worked a lot in the steel mills as an electrician, so he was working crazy hours, nights, doubles, and triples, which left my mom to deal with the house. My mother would experience countless fearful nights as pictures would fall from walls, knocks and pounding could be heard throughout the night, and multiple times she had to call my father's job to have him come check on things. Again, there are numerous experiences she had in the house. I would need to talk to her about it. One of the moments my father brings up the most happened in the basement. This occurred early in the timeline. The layout of the house plays a role. Basically, you could not access the basement from inside the house. You had to go outside and open the typical 2 doors that lead into a staircase. Also understand Buckshot and my father were inseparable. The dog would do anything for the family. He was trained very well. He protected his family. So one night soon after finishing the remodel, they hear knockings and banging in the basement, so of course my father believes there could be an intruder in the basement. My father grabs his Winchester 1200 and his dog and proceeds outside to go into the basement. He states that when he opened the doors, Buckshot, who any other time would have gone in first, backed up, and Coward was so afraid he let my father go into the cellar alone. He just stayed outside whining and growling. Of course nothing was found, just an empty basement, so that was when most of the craziness I stated really started. But here's the crazy thing. My mother's friends were getting married, so for the bachelorette party they went and a medium or a fortune teller. At that time, my mother thought it was dumb, but hey, it was just for fun. They have the part where the lady does her thing. When the party came to an end, the fortune teller picked on my mother. Looks at my mother, "You're having disturbances at your house?" My mother looks confused. "Yeah, how do you know that?" The lady said, "Put back what was taken, and everything will stop." It had been months of crazy things happening, and at the thought of it ending, even as insane as it sounds, they went to my grandparents, took the chest they removed, and put it back exactly where it was. At that point, everything stopped. No more knocking or pictures falling, no weird sounds, just peace. When they would move, not long after everything ended, they wound up taking a photo of the chest. It's a large picture of a group of soldiers. Oh, and one more note, when they sold, they told the next owners the chest must stay where it is. Last time they heard from the buyers, the chest still resides in their room in the cellar/basement. So this happened in September of 2017 while I was serving in the Army stationed out of Oahu, Hawaii. I'd only been there a little over a year. It was my first and only duty station. So we're training on another Hawaiian island called Hilo. The training ground was called PTA or Pohakaloa Training Area, which was located between Mauna Loa, Mauna Kea, and the Hualalai volcanic mountains. Anyways, it had been about 4 days into being in the box, and we had been staying at a mock village. To paint a picture, There was a larger village and smaller village just 100 feet up the road to the north. The smaller village had about 7 buildings with a gas station across the road. And the larger village had 19 buildings and a mosque that was on the southwest part. There was a wall that surrounded the south, east, and north sides of the larger village. My platoon was staying in the mosque, looking to the south and west. It was a 2-story building. The first room on the first floor was a center-fed room that went all the way back with another room the same size to the left of it. There was a staircase in that room on that left that came up into a hallway. So if you went left, there would be a room, and if you turned around while at the top of the stairs, the hallway would extend into an open room where the praying would take place. The ceiling had a big dome in the center of that room. The only thing we could see was this big hill to the south and then what looked like a rock farm slightly to the left of it, about a mile further out. There was enough light from the moon and stars to see silhouettes but still too dark to see faces. We didn't have electricity, so we relied on our headlamps. I had just finished fire guard at around 0200, so I knew that the only person awake was the guy that relieved me. I laid down in my sleeping bag, which was located in the hallway, loading into the dome room. About 4 feet to the right of me was my team leader, passed out. My head was against the wall, so I could see the 2 windows on the wall about 7 feet across from me. 15 minutes went by, and I remember hearing this silence I had never heard before. Just no crickets or wind, just dead silence. Which gave me this sense of unease. And then I saw a silhouette appear in front of the window on the right. It came from the left side, which I thought was weird because I would have seen it come from the left because of the other window. I was tired, so I was okay, maybe I missed it. Then I realized how tall this shadow was. Its shoulders came up to the top of the window, which was about 6 to 7 feet. The figure then moved towards my team leader at a regular walking pace. It startled me because I thought the person was going to trip over my TL, so in a calm but louder than normal voice I said, "Hey, watch out." And it kept going. But nothing happened, almost as if it kept going over my TL and through the wall. But I couldn't see it go through, it just vanished. The last thing on my mind was ghost. I couldn't comprehend what had happened at all. I had woken up my TL and the guy that was sleeping on the prayer mat directly under the dome. They're asking me what in the F I was talking about. I explained what I saw. That's when the guy on the prayer mat explained that it could have been a night marcher, which are Hawaiian tribal spirits that roam the volcanic plains of Hawaii. Apparently this wasn't the first time this had happened. The year prior at PTA, a buddy was on fire guard with his AG on the second floor. They then saw dim orbs of light out in the field to the south and between them and that hill about 150 to 200 feet out. So they used thermals on their nods but didn't see any heat sources. They also heard steps beneath them when they were the only ones in that building. This happened to me yesterday, and I'm still so confused. Me and my girlfriend were hanging out at around 2 a.m. when we decided to get food before she went home. Once we got our food, we ended up deciding to eat it in a church parking lot. As we were eating, I was getting a bit paranoid, kind of like a feeling we were being watched. I began looking around to see if there was anyone around us, but of course there was not. So I calmed down for a bit and go back to talking to my girlfriend when I noticed behind her head standing underneath the pavilion near us was some sort of shadow. I figured maybe it was just some lighting thing, but the more I stared at it, the more out of place it seemed. I'll admit I was pretty scared, so I asked my girlfriend if we could leave. She said yes, and we ended up leaving fairly quickly. On the way home, I'm just questioning if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or not. Then I look over at my girlfriend, and she has tears in her eyes. I ask her what's wrong, and she says to me, "Did you see that shadow too?" Safe to say I was pretty freaked out and began explaining to her that's the reason I wanted to leave. She then told me that she had noticed the shadow pretty much instantly once we began eating but decided not to tell me because she thought her mind was playing tricks on her too. We were both really freaked out and ended up going back to my house for a while longer because she was scared. Today though, we decided to go back at the same time to see if we were just freaking out about a lighting issue or something. I told her I didn't want to, but she was insistent that we go back. When we got there, it was around 1:30ish in the morning, so pretty close to the same time. We parked in the same spot and looked at the same angle we saw it from, and there was nothing. The area was just normal. She wondered if maybe what we saw was just a person standing there, but I don't think so. The shadow seemed unhuman, kind of like a dark mass. I'm still pretty freaked out about it, and it just won't leave my mind. I really wonder if what we saw was something paranormal, or maybe our minds were just playing tricks on us. About 10 years ago, I lived with my grandparents in this rural town in the middle of a cornfield, population 150 that includes the animals. My grandfather is a huge minimalist and insisted we did not use the air conditioner during the summer, so we spent a lot of time outside because the house was too hot. I started to camp in the yard instead of staying in my upstairs bedroom, where the heat seemed to hold longer. Every night, I would move my tent a little further from the farmhouse. No one was around to mess with me, so my grandparents didn't mind as long as I came home the next morning for breakfast. One evening, there was a meteor shower I wanted to see, but the glare from the one street lamp we had next to the house really screwed with star visibility. I spoke with my grandmother, and she gave me permission that night to camp in the woods. I've played there many times during the day, so I knew the area pretty well. There is one big circular clearing that would be perfect to set up in. It was really far from the house, but again, no one lived out here except us. I pitched my tent around sunset in the center of the clearing. Looking up, the canopy was nowhere near to obscuring my view of the sky. It was absolutely perfect. Later that evening I was awake reading, and around 10:30 I hear a noise from the woods. But not a normal woodland sound. The only way I can describe it is like two quarters were being dropped together. Ching ching ching. It was really rhythmic, too. I remember trying to reason it out, and I came up with a raccoon playing with some barn litter it found in a creek. I went back to reading. At 11:30 I'm trying to sleep, but the noise still hasn't stopped. I'm irritated, so I grab my flashlight and my phone, and I quietly move to the corner of my tent, where the zipper to open the door is. I didn't turn on my light, I was waiting to get outside before I did. I became aware of pressure on the side of my head. Someone was trying to reach through my tent to touch me. I can still remember the slow, steady pressure I felt going down the side of my face as I froze with fear. It was a heavy, slow pet that started on the top of my head and ended on my chin. After seconds that felt like minutes, I threw myself away from the corner. I saw and heard nothing. The chiming had stopped. I jumped back up, ripped my tent open, and looked around the clearing. Nothing. I called my grandmother. I have a little brother, and I wanted to make sure he was in bed even though he was terrified of the dark. While she was checking, I jogged around the clearing, looking and listening for anyone. She confirmed he was still in bed and that no one but me was out there. I never found anything or anyone. But it was too far for me to walk home that night, so I crawled back into my tent and tried to sleep. I remember listening for the chinging again, but it was so quiet. No frogs, no crickets, just the wind carrying an impending feeling of dread until the sun rose the next morning. We don't have any large predators in our area, and the canopy was too far from my tent to have something fall on me. To this day, I have no idea what it was. I just tear up and get goosebumps every time I think about it. I never returned there during the night. One night I had woken up around midnight to 1 a.m. because I needed to go to the bathroom. With the standard amount of grumbling because I didn't want to leave the warmth of my bed, I got up and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. Everything was perfectly normal until I went to go wash my hands. A sound on the stairs made me pause because it didn't sound like one of the cats. They're fat and old and have a very distinct way of going up and down the stairs. I listened as quick, light footsteps ran up the stairs and around the corner to come down the hallway. They ran up and down the hallway twice before stopping in front of the bathroom door, which I couldn't have been more than 3 feet away from. They breathed loudly, in, out, in, out, in, out. Then they ran back down the hall and down the steps into the kitchen, where they stopped making noise. I would have been able to hear them if they continued. I was, rightly, freaked the hell out because the sounds I had heard were very clearly made from a little kid, of which there were none in my house. The footsteps were too close together, light, and quick to be anyone in the house messing with me. In order to move that fast, anyone who lived there would have had to have made at least twice as much noise, and the only one capable of running as fast as what I heard would have been my sister, but again, she couldn't have done it that quietly. I ended up waiting for about 2 hours in the bathroom before finally coming back out and booking it to my room. Any perpetrators would have been heard if they tried to return to their room or if they were anywhere awake because our house is very quiet at night. I heard nothing after that night. No footsteps, no breathing, no activity. The next morning, I asked each of my family members individually and separately, so they couldn't talk to each other between my interrogations, if they had gotten up at all last night or if they heard anything last night. None are good liars, and I know when they're telling the truth, so when they all said that they slept through the night, I believed them. This is a true account, no exaggerations, no fluff. My name is Chris. I am 32 years old and writing this from South Florida. The story began back when I was 17 years old. It was a school night, and I was getting ready to go to bed as I normally do. I brushed my teeth, said goodnight to my family, and retired to my bedroom. In the house were my mother, stepfather, little brother, and sister. I had my own room. I always have my pre-night rituals I have to do before bed. I'm very meticulous when it comes to having my room neat and organized. Part of this pre-sleep routine was closing my closet doors and the bedroom door. I always close those before bed because it makes me feel safe. Just for context, prior to this experience, I never had anything abnormal, paranormal, or anything scary happen to me. So I wasn't afraid of the dark by any means. Finally, I'm in bed, and I lay down and put my glasses on the nightstand next to me. My vision is pretty bad, with both my eyes at about a -8 for vision. Meaning, without my glasses, I can't see a thing. Just blobs and balls of light with no definition. I doze off, and then sometime later I wake up abruptly, not knowing why exactly yet. I look to that same nightstand where there's a clock that illuminates the current time onto the ceiling like a projector. The time read 3:17 a.m. At that time I didn't know the significance of that time, so I shrugged it off and got ready to go back to bed. At this point I had sat up a bit because I was in a bit of a daze. I rubbed my eyes to readjust my focus when I realized my closet door was wide open. This was a long closet with about 4 different doors to it, but only one was opened, the one that was directly parallel to my position. I thought it was odd that it was open because, as I told you guys before, I always close that closet, but still, I wasn't too alarmed because maybe my mom came in and hung some clothes in my closet. Likely, but maybe. Now that I'm looking in the direction of the open closet, I should also note that inside this particular closet is a full-sized mirror. One that I use every day to get dressed before going to school. As I'm staring at this open closet, I gaze more intently at this mirror because I feel as if maybe I'm seeing a shadow in the room behind me, but again, my vision is bad, and there's a busy main street near my window where a car's headlights can absolutely be casting a shadow. So again, I'm not panicking or even too concerned yet. I continue staring into the mirror when the hairs on my neck shoot up and I have chills running through my body. I see something in the mirror, and it's directly behind me. I lean in a little closer to the mirror, and the shadow moves a little closer to me in response. I am now petrified. The feeling of calmness and level-headedness is gone. I'm frozen. Time passes, which feels like an eternity, and I turn my head around and I see this extremely tall man folded in a way that's anatomically impossible in order to reach my eye level. He's wearing an all-black trench coat and black hat. He's staring at me menacingly. But not only staring at me, he's looking into my very being. He's about 6 inches away from my face. His face looks evil. He looks like he's enjoying this. At this point, I finally get the courage to run away and bolt into my mom's room. I'm thinking to myself, I have to be dreaming, that can't be real, right? I wake my mom up in a panic, and I tell her about what just happened in my room. Her response word for word was, "You saw him too?" I nearly passed out. Years later, I found out this same entity has been seen by others as well. Here is my story. I was dating a beautiful woman, and I was working plumbing/heating. It was about 11 a.m., and I had a job to replace a floor furnace with a coworker at a local graveyard called Chapel of the Chimes. The floor furnace in question was in the old caretaker's house on the edge of the cemetery. It even had a headstone on the house's property, the only one, assuming it was the caretaker's. I was talking to the lady who lived there, and she was telling me the history of the house, and blah blah blah. One thing I remember is that the caretaker died on the porch I had to crawl under to get under the house. My girlfriend calls. She is done in the city, SF, this is in Berkeley, California, where the Chapel of the Chimes is, and she wants me to hurry and get off work so we can do the dirty. I say I will see what I can do. I get off the phone and tell my coworker, we are going to have to throw this in and get out of here, I have a date. I think this pissed off the caretaker, and he sent a demon after me. Anyway, we throw the furnace in, and I go home, and we get it done. I wake up later that night to my girlfriend hovering above me shaking me. She said, "You're making gurgling sounds in your sleep." I could not have been happier, because what I was experiencing was not being able to move, terrified for no reason, laying in bed trying to talk or get up. Keep trying to go back to sleep the rest of the night with the same result. As soon as I fell asleep, boom. Terror and sleep paralysis. Next night, same thing, except now we're starting to notice these bright streaks of light just streak by. Maybe 1 or 2 at a time, maybe it was the same orb? Still no sleep. Third or fourth night, same thing, but this time it is happening to my girlfriend, and she said she felt hands with claws coming up her thighs. We don't sleep again that night, stay up and stare at the orbs. Next night, I wake up terrified, but I can move. I sit up in the bed and look ahead. Between me and the door is a fat lady in black clothing with a hat, old-time clothes. Would say maybe Columbus times? Colonial attire? I grab my phone off the ground and run past her, push her out the way, push the door open the RV, and scream, "Help. But nothing would come out. My girlfriend wakes me up again. I can't stress how real it feels in sleep paralysis. We decided to go to a support group meeting. There was a woman/friend, and I told the story too. She said the same thing happened to her friend, and he jumped off a bridge. I'm extremely sleep deprived at this point, and death doesn't sound terrible. She hands me a piece of paper with the Archangel Michael prayer on it. We go home that night and say the prayer, put salt in 4 corners of the room, and threw unburnt sage everywhere. All the cabinets, everywhere. It didn't happen that night. I was about 9 years old and visiting my dad's house for the weekend. I was sitting on the floor coloring at the coffee table in the living room when I heard my dad's voice behind me say hey. Very playfully, like a slightly raised voice as if trying to get my attention to show me or tell me something fun. So I turned around to look in the direction of the voice, and I saw my dad peeking around the corner from the hallway. It was just his head, like he was leaning out from the hallway, and he was smiling like he was being playful. So I turned back around just really quickly to cap my marker and stand up to go see what he wanted, but when I turned back around, he was gone. So I said hey back kind of in the same way but with like a hey, what did you want? kind of tone, no response. So again, I called out a little louder and with a slightly more annoyed tone, Dad, hello, what? Waited, no response. So I got up and walked down the hallway I had seen him coming from, and he wasn't in the hall, so I followed the hall to his room, and he wasn't in there, not in his bathroom. What? This was a small house, BTW, literally a trailer. There are no other rooms back there, there's only one small hallway leading that way that ends at his room. No exits from this end of the house and very small, inconvenient windows with decorations, not something he would ever climb through unless an emergency. So there's really only one way in and one way out. So at this point my heart is pounding and has dropped down into my stomach because I'm like, what is going on? So now I'm yelling his name and walking through the house, very small, as I said, literally like 10 steps from his room at the end to where I had been sitting, and I finally go outside, and he is in his shed in the backyard, woodworking with power tools and goggles and gloves and all that gear on, like he had been doing that for hours. And, knowing there was no possible way he could have gotten past me to get outside without me seeing, I still asked him if he was just inside, and did he just say hey to me while I was in the living room at the table? And of course he said no, I've been out here. And literally nothing else like that ever happened again. I never figured it out. I still remember this experience so clearly. As a logical adult today, I still know what I saw and believe that there was no way my actual dad could have been in that house with me. Once again, I am a logical adult. I know that sometimes people hear things that aren't there, sometimes people see sounds that aren't there, and I understand the science behind it. But how is it possible that I heard his voice first, then turned around and saw him there, in broad daylight, with no TV or radio in the background, no other people in the house? I'm from Southeast Asia. A little more than 15 years ago, when I was about 7, I lived in my very first house, which eventually became haunted by not just one but many paranormal entities. You can say a mass haunting. It was an apartment-type house. My mom and dad haven't gotten divorced yet. My dad had a friend who's a druggie and would come by to either play video games with my dad or just have a safe place to use. We were all close to him, and he was a nice guy, actually. One night he came banging on our front door, and he looked freaked out. He went deep into a forest nearby our house to use. He said while he was using he saw a Pontianak, a little info about this entity, long hair covered face, white clothed. If you hear her far away, it means she is near. If you hear her near you, it means she is actually far away, which is a tactic to lure people. Some people either hear her hum a song, cry, or laugh in a super high-pitched voice, which kind of sounds like a bird except that no bird in the world sounds like that. She floats or flies instead of walking. Back to the story, while my dad's friend was using in the forest, he saw the entity, and it chased him. Stupidly, our house was the first place he ran to. My parents opened the door and let him in. A few days later, creepy things started to happen at my apartment level. Our windows were opaque, and some nights we would see a tall woman with long hair and white clothing pass by the window without any footsteps heard, and it looked more like it floated past. One of the neighbors had a dog, and some nights in the AMs it would bark furiously. The neighbor said she saw it standing in her house while her dog was barking at it. It did nothing but stand there. My other neighbors saw it in their houses too, and it seems the entity would roam about. One morning at 6 a.m., I was waiting for my mom to get ready to send me to school, so I sat at the living room sofa. The TV was in front, and the dining table was at the back. I saw it in the reflection of my TV, long black hair and white cloth sitting at the dining table area. I looked back to see that all the dining table chairs were empty. I kept looking at the reflection in the dining area back and forth, but nothing was making any sense, to which I slowly realized what it was, and I took a pillow to cover my face and ears while lying down on the sofa. About half an hour or so, my mom woke me up, and when I looked at the TV reflection, the entity was gone. My life was hell back then with a violent and physically abusive dad, so things weren't smooth at all. What made things worse with the hauntings was when my dad did black magic rituals. He would draw those diagrams like those in the occult using his blood and cigarette ashes. He would turn every religious display on the wall upside down in the house when he did the ritual. All of this was done when me and my mom weren't in the house. After all that, things got worse. Shadow people started showing up at night. Some nights my mom would be woken up by me to help me switch on the toilet light, as I am small and couldn't reach the switch. I would always wake her up in the night to help me with this. One night she would be woken up by me to help switch on the toilet light. As she was waiting, she called for me but got no response. Plot twist, I was actually asleep in my room, and it wasn't me that woke her up to go to the toilet. One night, my dad invited his other friend over to stay the night. I decided to sleep in the hall with his friend named Gary. Gary started hearing someone whisper calling his name from the front door. Weirdly, I couldn't hear anything at all, and it kept on and on till he freaked out and left the house immediately that night. It was the last time he came to our house. The next paranormal activity is when our toilet taps would turn on, but as soon as any one of us walked towards the toilet, it would stop, and our toilet flush would go off on its own too. I would hear mass whispers in the middle of the night but couldn't make out what the whispers were saying. I would also hear buzzing sounds when this happened, and no, I was not sleep paralyzed at all. I was wide awake and moving freely. If you've seen the video of a YouTuber exploring an abandoned mine in the night to review a flashlight and hearing whispers, that's what it sounded like. Another night my dad got the worst out of all of us. The shadow entity started climbing on top of him and choking him, two to be exact, one on top of him and another standing at the side of him, both with glowing red eyes. I've seen other weird things, like a white silhouette of a boy standing directly in front of me for a good 2 seconds before slowly disappearing into thin air. I've also seen a shadow dart past the room. Even after my parents' divorce, the hauntings persisted. Me and my mom went to stay at her brother's place while she rented out our home to foreigners for about 2 to 3 solid years. The tenants had not seen or heard any weird things in the house while we were gone, so we assumed the haunting was over. Well, the entity with the long black hair and white cloth was gone, but the demonic entity that my father brought from his rituals was still tormenting the place when me and my mom moved back. We would still get shadow entities dart past the halls, but nothing more than that. My mom sold the house a long time ago. My experience with Malvern Manor. In the spring of 2011, my wife and I went to look at a house for sale in Malvern, a small town in southwestern Iowa. It was an old mansion the town banker had built way back in the day. It didn't give off creepy vibes, but it didn't appeal to me at all, despite its price of $199,000. It also needed a lot of work. It was a large house with way more space than 2 people with no kids, and no plans to have kids either, would ever need. The odd thing was it had a vault room buried in the yard with a tunnel that connected to it from the tiny basement boiler room. There was supposedly a large safe in it. The door to the tunnel was screwed shut, and the owners said they had never gone in there. You could see the vault room from outside because there was a small hump/hill in the yard. For the next 2 weeks, I had horrific nightmares about that house. Which I found odd considering I had no reason to fear it. I don't remember details, but they were the scariest nightmares I've ever had. Wife and I divorced that fall. Fast forward to the summer of 2020. I'm having 6 social distancing beers in a driveway with friends, and I'm telling them this story. Don't recall why it came up. Well, the following morning I'm nursing my hangover and flipping through Amazon Prime, and I see there's a paranormal documentary about that house, Malvern Manor. I felt immediately flushed with fear and had goosebumps for half an hour. I've not watched the documentary, but friends that have told me there's no mention of that tunnel or vault room. This is the scariest thing I've experienced, and the closest thing to anything paranormal as well. The town I spent most of my life in was weird, to say the least. Like a suburban town on the edge of a major metropolitan region, go in the opposite direction of the city, and it almost immediately gives way to forests, fields, farmland, lakes, and swamps. You get the idea. There was this weird mix of Midwest horror combined with we live in/near a major modern city, that stuff isn't real. My friends and I would half jokingly, but only half, say that there's a dead/sleeping elder god beneath the town as a means of explaining all the strangeness. By far, the most frightening experience I had was at the abandoned Children's Psychiatric Center, the last vestige of a larger asylum complex that had otherwise been torn down years before my friends and I were born.
There were plenty of strange/scary things that happened there, which really begs the question of why we kept going back, especially after some of the things we experienced. But the worst for me personally was when I, a pretty big guy, both height and weight, got lifted and thrown against a wall.
After our previous visit, where disembodied footsteps ran at us down a dark corridor, chasing us out of that particular wing, we decided to hide in one of the inpatient rooms of a different wing to scare a group of friends we called to meet up with us. The room's window was missing, but the overgrown bushes covered most of it, making us able to easily hide inside and see out without being seen. The plan was that the second group would walk in through the missing door, round the corner, and we'd throw open the door and surprise them. Stupid teenager shenanigans. Well, me and a couple other guys were leaning next to / against the door to keep it shut, and we kept hearing voices on the other side. Like, a little boy and little girl having a conversation and giggling. Which freaked us out because kids that young never went anywhere near that place, much less inside it. Eventually, the other group showed up, but they called us out, saying they saw one of us peek out the window. With the cat out of the bag, one of the guys, who hadn't been near the door and hearing the voices, goes to step into the hallway. Every hair on my body stood on end as he started opening the door, and I instinctively shoved him out of the way. Next thing I know, I'm lifted off my feet and pinned against a wall that was 5 feet behind me, completely unable to breathe. Everyone except the other two guys who had heard the voices on the other side of the door bolted, either into the hallway and to the exit or just straight out the window and into the bushes. The two who stayed behind grabbed me from the wall and dragged my limp body outside. I was deathly pale and only got my color back and was able to breathe again after we crossed the threshold and exited the building. I needed help walking until we were fully off the property, and during that time, the guys from the second group told us that the person they'd seen peeking out didn't match the appearance of anyone in our group and it also appeared at one of the other windows, not the one to the room we'd been hiding in. They had just assumed one of us had a younger brother that tagged along. After we left the property, I would occasionally turn pale again, then suddenly start dry heaving. Nothing visible came out of me, but my shadow showed me vomiting something, ectoplasm? Whatever it was, its shadow was kind of flickery and not quite there, like how the air gets warped over hot pavement. Only went back to the place a few times after that, but only ever to the grounds, never inside. Eventually, we stopped going at all, and the place was finally torn down a few years before the pandemic. With everything that happened there, it makes me wonder about the neighborhood next to it. After all, those homes were built on the ground where the original asylum once stood. This happened 3 years ago. At the time, I was about 20. My youngest sister and her best friend, Ilena, are 5 years younger than me. My sister and I have always been close and grew up playing with each other, so hanging out with her and Ilena wasn't all that weird. Ilena lives behind us, just separated by an alley. A little backstory on Ilena's house: it's haunted. Her father sees children and hears them laugh. My sister sometimes sees a little boy in the bathroom. Ilena's room is at the very end of the hallway. Across from her room is her grandpa's room when he comes down to visit. My sister gets scary vibes from his room. There are crosses and pictures of Jesus and saints on the walls of the room. My sister and I have seen gray/blackish smoke on the kitchen ceiling that vanishes within seconds. The worst part is Ilena's mother waking up with scratches all on her back. I'm not sure if this is worth mentioning, but the mother's friend was allegedly possessed a week before the scratches. Ilena's mother and father separated shortly after that. They had some problems in their marriage other than the scratches. One day Ilena was home alone. Her father wasn't coming back until the next day. My sister and I went over around 1 to hang out. There's this game that lets you communicate with ghosts using pencils. I'm not sure what it's called, but there are two people that are across from each other holding a pencil in each hand. The tips/erasers touch, and you ask questions while the erasers are touching. If it moves up and down, it's either a yes or a no. If the pencils cross, maybe. My sister and I were the ones asking questions, and Ilena was on the bed watching us. I was a little skeptical since it wasn't a Ouija board and didn't know how pencils would let us talk to the paranormal. We found out we were communicating with this Mexican man that was a nice ghost. We asked if he knew who was scratching Ilena's mom, and he said he did, but it wasn't him. We asked if there are kids in the house and a boy in the bathroom. The Mexican man said yes. We had a nice chat with him and said our goodbyes. We're Catholic, and it was Ash Wednesday. Growing up with Catholic grandparents and a grandmother from Mexico, you know not to mess with the dead. But we won a church getting our ashes, thinking it would give us extra protection. I laugh at that thought now. We went to the latest service about 8 p.m. We got back to Ilena's around 9. We decided to play in the living room this time. My sister and I were asking questions, and Ilena was watching on the couch. This time the ghost we were talking to was a bit boring, always answering with a maybe. We asked if we could say goodbye, but it was still saying no. We were all getting a little annoyed and worried. Out of nowhere, the remote control that was sitting on the drawer flew on and off. We looked at each other and ran out the door. We were down the block and realized, if we told my mom we were doing this, she would be mad. We also left Eilena's door open, and my phone and purse were still on the couch. We all went back together. We were at the door arguing about who was going inside to get my purse and phone. We were all chickens. As we were arguing, I saw a flash of blue lights above our heads. We all ran back to my house and asked each other what we saw. My sister and her friend saw the living and kitchen lights turn on and off, but I seen blue flashes of lights above us. We finally went to tell my mom. The weird thing is, when we went up to her with worried faces, she asked if we were doing something we weren't supposed to. We told her what happened but left out the part of us trying to communicate with the paranormal. I wouldn't call my mom sensitive to the paranormal, however, she has experiences herself. I'll share another time. But she said she felt or heard from the unknown that we were up to no good and playing games she would call evil. We confessed, I don't know how she knew. We never mentioned that game to her, knowing how she would react to it, and never played that game in our house. My mother came back with us to Eilena's house to grab my purse and cell phone. My mom asked my sister for the pencils so she could burn them. We found all of them but one. Not sure if you realized already, but we did not say goodbye to the ghost. I'm not sure if saying goodbye had anything to do with the missing pencil, but we looked everywhere and couldn't find it. The farm. My grandma lived on a huge farm when I was a little kid, and I loved going to stay with her. I love animals, and a farm is any little kid's dreamland. She owned a lot of land, and my brother and I were allowed to go anywhere we wanted as long as we stayed on the property and came back before dark. One day we decided to follow a creek all the way to its end, which resulted in us crossing the fence and leaving my grandma's property. We soon came across an old rundown cabin, and for some reason we decided to go inside. Young curiosity, I guess. As we stepped inside, it was as if we walked into a totally different cabin. From the outside, it was very old and almost falling apart. But on the inside, it was as if a family lived there. There were dishes on the table as if they just had dinner, and it actually smelled like spaghetti. The beds were all made up perfectly. The furniture was outdated but still in good condition. The floor and the wallpaper are in good condition. No dust or cobwebs. No dirt or damp smell. It was warm. It was as if the family left in a hurry and left all of their belongings behind. And definitely not that long ago. We ran all the way back to my grandma's house, excited to tell her about our new discovery. After a good scolding about leaving the property and a game of 20 questions, my grandma wanted to see this place for herself because her closest neighbor wasn't even near the area we were describing to her. We all three set off to find the cabin. We followed the creek as we had done before, past the fence, and went all the way out to where the cabin was, except this time there was no cabin. It was gone. We looked for an hour trying to find it and couldn't. My grandma finally decided it was time to go back. She was pretty annoyed at us for leaving the property, but she never discredited our claims of seeing this cabin. I look back on it, and lots of weird things happened on the farm. I just never realized it until I was older. The supernatural is also very drawn to my grandma and my brother. They both have many paranormal experiences that I personally saw, they just weren't happening to me. If you want to hear more tellings of the farm or my family, let me know. Disclosure: not my story, but this is my mother's story, and she gave me permission to share. I will be telling from her perspective. We live in the desert, and things are always weird. Let's jump in. I was watching a movie while lying in bed and heard the chime of the security camera app notification. Now I had the app set that only the front door would give loud alerts at this time of night, but all the cameras were recording, just not providing alerts. This made me curious as to what is out there this late, and I sat up and checked the recording. I saw a large coyote pacing in and out of the front door patio space, which is not very large and sort of enclosed. I thought that was kind of odd since it didn't really look like the coyote was hunting anything, and there's nothing in that area to pique the coyote's interest. I then began making my way towards the front door. I got to the door and looked through the peephole to see if I could see any animals that it might be hunting for, and what I saw stole my breath. I saw what was the back of a bald head in the peephole. I stood for about a minute not moving or breathing, and this bald head never moved either. Let me be clear, this looked like a man standing very close to the door with his back turned to the door. Finally, I ran to the dining room windows to get a clear view of who was standing at the door. When I got to the window, no one was there. I went and checked the peephole again, and nothing was there anymore. Now there is no way anyone could walk in any direction without alerting one of the cameras around the home, so I immediately went to check the recordings. After the coyote, there was nothing. This freaked me the hell out, as the cameras are set to record motion and clearly caught the coyote but never showed anyone walking up or leaving. I hope you have an explanation that gives me some peace of mind. Ever since I was little, I have always felt something off in every house we have moved to. I have moved 4 times ever since I was born. I'm still in my teenage years. My family has always felt off too. Whenever I was 3, we were living with my aunt in Jemison, Alabama. It was a pretty small place, but 2.5 years prior, my biological dad passed away. I had never met him, but my mom told me that whenever I was that age we were going through some stuff of his. Just a quick thing to add in before my dad passed away and my mom was not on good terms. Well, while we were looking at his stuff, I was asking questions, and then I just came out with, "Dad wants you to know he's still mad at you," and my mom was just in shock. She didn't really know what to say. My aunt's house was huge, though. I hated the back room in it, though it was truly just scary to me. It was so cold in that room, and my aunt usually kept the AC on 74. That was the only room in the house that was cold. I used to hear people whispering in the room. It was terrifying. Fast forward to whenever I turned 5, we moved to my uncle's house in Mobile, Alabama. It was about 4 to 5 hours away from Jemison. Everything was going fine till my aunt, who we had just moved from, died. She died of breast cancer in the house we had just moved into. It's been 7 years since she's been gone, and that's when all hell broke loose. We started hearing things break at night, doors slamming, and shadows going across the walls at night. My uncle is a truck driver, so he wasn't home most of the time. He was gone for about a month, then came back for a week, then he would leave again. So we knew it wasn't him. But we ended up leaving to move into a house about 30 minutes from our uncle's house. The man who lived there last killed himself in the kitchen. That house made me probably the most uncomfortable I had ever been. I couldn't sleep in my own room, so I slept on the 3rd floor with my mama. I was around 9 at the time. My room would slam shut at night whenever my mom would get up to go to the bathroom. She and my stepdad slept on the bottom floor, but the bathrooms were on the 2nd floor and the 3rd. One time she woke up on the morning of August 3, 2014 and asked me, "Jasmine, were you in your room last night?" Note this, I had never slept alone in my life. I have been that terrified. I looked at her and laughed a little and was like, "Mama, you know I can't do that," and she just started on complete horror, and she told me that there was someone in my room last night that sounded like a child playing with my dolls or some type of toy you talked to that sounded like me. My mom and stepdad got married at that house, and in the background of her wedding photos of my uncle walking her down the aisle, you see 2 faces in the bathroom and kitchen window. We ended up moving after that encounter to the house we are in now. On December 15, 2015, my brother was born. We didn't hear or see things for a while after he was born until just recently. My brother was crying and yelling for my mom to help in the living room, and my mom ran to him. He was screaming bloody murder that someone had his leg and was trying to take him. No one was there, but sure enough, his leg was up in the air, and he was at an angle you can't just hold your leg up at, and it looks like that. My brother has epilepsy, so we were like, okay, it's just another sleepwalk episode until he drew the woman he was talking about. My parents are really strict, he is not allowed to watch anything scary. He drew a woman with long hair, and she was just demonic looking. I was completely horrified and went and showed my mom immediately. She was just scared then, and now ever since we haven't brought it up again, but every once in a while he will bring her up and tell me she's going to get me, him, or the family. My brother is also a very creepy individual. The night of August 20, 2020, I had a very bad allergic reaction and almost died, like literally my breathing had gone down, my blood pressure and heart rate were dropping quickly, but that night, Killian is his name, and he told me, "Jassy Rip, I'm going to miss you." He has never heard anything like that, he isn't around death, he never has been, but somehow he knew to tell me that. I luckily recovered from it quite quickly, with ulcers in my stomach and blisters on my tongue and throat. Demon encounter in New Caledonia. I am a 22-year-old French-Canadian female from Quebec City, and last year, I experimented with something out of the ordinary. I was studying in Tahiti, French Polynesia, for about 3 months when I decided to participate in a 2-week field trip to New Caledonia, organized by my host university. Before joining the trip, I had little knowledge of New Caledonia and the culture of the people who live there. Many of my Tahitian friends were somehow a little uncomfortable with staying on Connex lands due to former tribal rivalries and magic practice, but I didn't think much of it because, as I said, I knew little about the Connex native culture at the time, and I just believed they were only anxious about leaving the island for the first time. The first week of the trip was amazing. We had so much fun discovering New Maya during the day and partying at night. Then, for the second week, we left the capital to travel to the center of the island, where we would stay a couple of days in the mountains, in a nice camp. I shared a room with my colleague Kat from Quebec, who was part of the exchange program in Tahiti like me and entered the trip too. One night, as our group was heading back to the camp from the restaurant where we enjoyed a nice meal, I got blown away by the stars in the sky. I had never seen so many in my life. They were so shiny and sparkling, I stopped walking to look at them, and this is when I felt something weird on my left barefoot. It was a sensation I had never felt before. As if something was caressing my foot with a million little needles. Then, I felt a strong sting, followed by an intense, rising pain on the top of my foot. I immediately let out a huge scream of pain, and tears rushed to my eyes. It was so bad. My Tahitian friend Howell ran to me and carried me to the camp, where the light showed my foot, which was already swirling like crazy. My teachers ran to me, wondering what happened, and when they saw my foot and what looked like a centipede bite, one of them started sucking the venom out of the womb. I couldn't stop crying. I was in so much pain, and I was pissed that I didn't get the chance to see the thing that had bitten me. South Sea centipedes are poisonous, but they won't kill you, they just hurt like crazy. Another Tahitian friend of mine, Vi, came and poured a Chinese remedy on it, and I felt the pain dim down a little. There was nothing more we could do that night about this incident, so I went to sleep, hoping that the day after I would be feeling better. Kat was already sleeping when I got to bed. I managed to climb onto my bunked bed and fell asleep immediately. It wasn't long that I was awoken, but an uneasy feeling. I opened my eyes and saw an imposing dark figure in the right corner of the room. It was standing in the dark, just before the door. Fear invaded my body. I tried to scream to wake up Kat, but only a little squeaking noise from my part could be heard. I was totally aware of my surrendering, and I could see her sleeping in her bed, unaware of the situation. I couldn't move at all. I was paralyzed. My attention was turned towards those two red eyes that shone in the corner of the room. I couldn't see its face, but this thing, this creature, certainly was not human. I remember that its arms were so long that it could touch me without even having to move closer to my bed and leave the dark corner of the room. It kept caressing me with his long claws that hung at the ends of his large fingers. I could feel the tears running down my cheeks and the panic that was confusing my mind. It caressed me like that from head to toes for what seems like an eternity. Then, as it was getting more violent with its touch and approaching furthermore my bed, my Tahitian friend Vi entered the room, unexpected. It vanished immediately. And I sort of woke up, panicking. She was only checking me and my foot. She gave me 2 Tylenols to dim down my fever and the pain. Of course, I tried to tell her that I saw a monster in the corner of my room, and of course, she did not believe me and laugh it off because, as she was saying, I was being delirious from the poisonous bite. But it felt so real. No need to say that I didn't sleep well that night. I have never seen this entity again, but I still think of it quite often, and I really wonder what this supernatural creature was that I saw that night in New Caledonia. I never suffered from night terrors or sleep paralysis before, and this is why I keep thinking that I encountered a creepy entity that night, and for some reason, it is linked to this centipede bite. I have been doing some research on the signification of centipedes in the Gothic culture as well as the Tahitian culture, but nothing matches the description of the event of that night. Since this encounter, I've been calling centipedes demon creatures, and, till this day, I have never walked barefoot on grass again. The Early Riser. True story. A 12-year-old girl named Milan was in 7th grade and fell asleep early on a school night. She had very religious family members, but she wasn't as close but was pretty close to God in her opinion. Anyway, she had prayed that night right before she fell asleep, and every night that she remembers to pray, she asks God to protect her and her family from anything bad that could possibly happen and to protect them from demons. At this point in time, she believed in demons but wasn't really sure what they were, what they could do, or even if she would be afraid if she encountered one. So about a month prior, she had gotten really spooked after watching The Exorcism of Emily Rose. She thought it was a great movie and that the actors did a wonderful job, but it gave her nightmares. So she remembers waking up and just having this sinking feeling inside her. She couldn't explain exactly what the feeling was, but she was very worried about something, even though she knew that she shouldn't be since she had 2 dogs in her bedroom and was never allowed to shut her door anyway. So at this point she decides to look at her watch. The time is precisely 2:54 a.m. That means that she was even more uneasy due to the fact that it was almost 3 a.m. So she decides to look out the window to help herself breathe and hopefully fall back asleep. She's starting to feel her eyelids getting heavy, and she knows that she will be falling asleep soon enough since she normally wasn't as tired as she was in that moment. So she starts to close her eyes, but something pulls her to blink the fatigue off. Milan doesn't know what that thing is but looks outside again. She then sees something that scares her more than almost anything. Standing and staring into her window at her was a dark, fairly tall, hooded creature. It was just standing there, staring. So she sees the Bible on her nightstand and grabs it as she turns onto her side and shuts her eyes. She hugs the Bible so tightly that it leaves marks in her arms. As she's doing this, she can feel the presence of what she now presumes is the devil or some satanic entity in her bedroom. It should be noted at this moment that even though animals can sense paranormal presences, everyone was asleep. It was as if there was a spell put on all of them to keep them from waking up. She was a bit of a fanatic for horror stories and paranormal experiences, so part of her had wished that something like in the movie was going to happen to her someday, but she was not prepared. Milan hugs the Bible even tighter and feels this awful burning on her chest that's filled with the biggest amount of pressure that her body has ever been under. As this burning sensation continues, she has this vision in her mind. It's a vision of a white heart that is bleeding and flashes the words on them, the devil and Satan. As all of this is happening, she states that she heard the most petrifying voice that she has ever heard in her ear. It whispered the devil, and then she made a small noise that is the equivalent of someone using all their strength to push a boulder, and everything stopped. Nothing moved, there are no sounds, and everything just stopped. She waited for 10 to 20 minutes to finally open her eyes again and immediately got out of bed and put the pin on that she got from her great-grandmother that related to Christian Sunday school. She put the Bible under her pillow and, after about 45 minutes, finally fell asleep again. The newest morning she was woken up by her mother, who was oblivious to everything that had happened earlier that morning. She got up, got ready for school, and put the pin on her school clothes. She hoped it would help protect her. As she was getting ready, she started talking to God. She said that there was no way that the devil would ever get to her and that she would always worship only the Father. Then, as she was about to leave for school, she looked outside. Right where the entity or whatever it seemed to be was in the grass. All the grass and moss was dead. Nothing on the ground in that area was still living. She got so freaked out, but none of her 7 close friends believed her. Not even Milan's best friend, her grandfather, who had experienced something paranormal as well. The only people who believed her were her 2 grandmothers. They were the only ones who believed her because they were not only very religious themselves but had grown up in highly religious households. She still has chest pain in that area, and this day she cannot sleep with her back to the window. The house I grew up in was built in the early 1900s. It had some renovations, but for the most part, it was original. My dad and I lived there by ourselves. His room was on the ground level, and mine was on the 2nd floor. I had never really experienced anything paranormal per se. There were some odd occurrences here and there, but usually we just chalked it up to old house noises. That is until this night. It was around 4 in the morning. I was sleeping in my bed when I heard the floor creak out in the hall. The sound woke me up. I heard more creaking as if someone had walked past my room to the end of the hall. I called out, "Dad?" No answer. As soon as I realized it was not my dad in the hall, the air suddenly got thick and heavy. Dense in a way. It felt hard to breathe. I started to panic. I sat up and flicked on my bedside lamp. You know when you listen really hard for something and you hear every single tiny sound? Your heartbeat, breathing, and the ringing in your ears. I swear I could almost hear the thing in the hall holding its breath. I could hear it frozen in its last movement so as not to be discovered. I sat there for what felt like forever. Then I heard a sound. My dad got up from his bed. The floor creaked as he walked to the bathroom and shut the door. The shower turned on. Then the dense feeling left. My heart started racing. It felt like being released from terror's grasp. My breathing was fast and irregular as I tried to comprehend what just happened. My hands were trembling as I sat there, unsure of what to do. Stomp, 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 stomp. It came from downstairs. Not just downstairs, but at the bottom of the staircase. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Oh my God, it was coming up the stairs. Stomp, 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 stomp. It went back down the first 5 steps. Then continued through the living room, dining room, kitchen, and back again to the bottom of the stairs. It stomped loudly the entire time, making the house rattle. How could my dad not hear it? It was going right by the bathroom door each time. The shower couldn't possibly drown out the footsteps. It was just too loud. It continued back and forth through the house. My dad showered the entire time. It only stopped when the shower turned off. As soon as my dad was out of the bathroom, I was calling for him to come upstairs. I replayed everything back to him in a trembling voice. He told me it was just the house noises and water going through the pipes. The usual BS we told ourselves. It wasn't until years later, after moving out, that he told me the truth. He knew there was something in that house. He had felt it too. One night he woke up to see a figure standing at the foot of his bed. When he sat up and turned the light on, no one was there. He did some research and learned the man who used to own our house and the surrounding crops had died in the house. Apparently he was just checking out the new inhabitants of his home. The Hunchback. My home city has a large park just over a kilometer, about 0.7 miles, long. The park, located in Wales/UK, features a small wooded area near the castle at one end, a river with 2-foot bridges leading out to the west, and a largely fenced-in area to the east, except for my entry point. I was walking home late from a friend's house. I'd been on an exercise kick, and the hour walk around the park's perimeter would have gotten me up to 20,000 steps in one day. By the time I reached the park, however, I was feeling pretty tired, so I decided to go through as a shortcut. I do stupid shit like this all the time. I'm a large man with all the tremendous privilege this brings, even though I have been attacked at night a couple of times over the years that had tended to happen near bars and clubs as opposed to the deserted park. Also, prior to this, I hadn't heard of any crimes connected with this park at night. I'm not sure why I did it, but when I entered the park, instead of turning left past the ornamental gardens, over a 1-foot bridge, and out of the park, my tired brain thought that right towards the northern footbridge would be a quicker route. After a few minutes I realized I'd made an error. Not only was this way slightly longer but also as silent and lonely as a tomb. To the right of the path, there was a recreational field, and to my left, a small wood. I should point out that I grew up near forests, so they are a second home to me, and I know their sounds well and spent much time in them at night. After about 5 minutes of walking along the wide, curving path, I did a routine peek behind me and spotted someone following. They were quite a way back at that point, and I could have easily blotted them out with my thumb. Usually this wouldn't have unnerved me, but they had their hood up and were walking with an unusual gait as if they had something wrong with their spine or legs. I reasoned it was probably a homeless guy, and if he had issues walking, he wasn't going to catch up with me. I didn't even know if he could see me, as I was in a much darker part of the park. As I continued walking, though, he seemed to keep pace and even gained slightly on me. Every time I turned around, I could see his head bobbing with an unusual gait. Weirdly, and I'm not sure if this was due to the darkness, my eyesight, or just the way I remembered it, but he looked like a cliché hunchback from an old Hammer horror movie. He was creeping me out now, and I wondered if he was high, and that's why he was staggering, so I pulled an old trick. I used a lot to escape forest weirdos as a child and entered the woods. I knew about 5 or 6 feet into the trees I would be near invisible. I went in 10 just in case and crouched into a bush, donning my navy-colored COVID face mask and putting my hood up to minimize my high albedo Celtic pale skin showing up from the road. After a couple of minutes, I heard him approach, grunting as he struggled to move his body. Illuminated only by the moonlight, he got to where I had vanished, which coincided with a bend that would have temporarily obscured me from view when I slipped into the woods. My logic being that if he was following me, he might give up now. I did at this point feel kind of bad that if he was a man with a disability walking home, my disappearance might also have scared him. That said, there had been enough weird crimes during lockdown for me to be primarily thinking of my own safety. At least I knew I wasn't going to attack him. I waited for a few minutes, and after passing my hiding place for a few meters, he stopped and looked around him. He was breathing heavily, and I got my first decent look at him. He was still obscured and sort of low-res from my vantage point, but I could make out that he was hunched over and wearing a ducking black cloak or blanket and not a coat and hoodie as I had assumed. At this point I had convinced myself, for my sanity's sake, that he was some prankster looking to scare me, so I remained motionless and waited. It reminded me of the scene from Lord of the Rings where the hobbits are hiding from the ring wraiths and Frodo is tempted to put the ring on, except the trembling ring in this scene was connected to my bowels. After a couple of seconds of searching, he decided to turn back the way he came. I really hoped that this joker wasn't some disabled homeless guy, and I'd made him take a detour, but I wasn't going to let him follow me either. I waited, watching him until he was out of sight and I couldn't hear his grunting, and I emerged quietly from the bushes. If he was near where I had first spotted him now, a bend in the road and distance in the darkness would obscure him totally. I trotted along the road, checking over my shoulder occasionally, until I reached my final boss level of the shortcut, where the recreational field ended and the path was now lined by trees on both sides. Glancing over my shoulder one more time before I entered this darker, creepier part of the path, my heart sank when I suddenly saw the hunchback once again behind me. It seemed impossible that he would have caught up unless he had pulled the same trick as I did. He was moving quickly now in a sort of lopsided gallop, grunting and wheezing loudly. I felt like I could take him in a fight but had no idea what was concealed under his blanket, so I started to jog, scared of going too fast as the path was uneven and I was at more risk of falling over in the dark. Luckily the enclosed wooded area wasn't that wide, so I was quickly on the more even footpath next to the river, sprinting towards the footbridge, which was just above a weir. Behind me the hunchback stopped and let out a long mournful cry that turned my blood to ice, half moan, half howl, weirdly animalistic. Once I reached the other side of the river, I was in open playing fields and not far from home. A young couple had been making out on a bench and leapt to their feet when they saw me coming. The guy asked me, "What the duck was that?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know, some psycho or something, I wouldn't stick around." They got up and quickly went off down the riverside path on this side of the bridge. I looked back one last time and saw his weird outline a split second before he melted into the darkness of the woods before I turned around and sprinted the rest of the way home. Several months later, and I feel my brain has done a number on me, making him seem hazy and non-corporeal almost in my mind. Since then there have been a weird spike of bad incidents in the park, a devastating act of vandalism whereby several trees were cut down and park facilities destroyed by a gang of organized vandals. I didn't really think of it at the time, but one of the weirdest things about this all is that the Weir crossing is called Black Weir, and I entered a part of the park called Blackfriars because it was once the site of a Dominican religious order monastery. Whatever was happening, yours truly is not going back at night again. One that scared me badly was when I was about 21. My friends and I went into a local cemetery one night to check out the train grave, which was the grave of a man who died in the 1960s while working on a train. There is a piece of a train on his grave marker, a coupler, I think. That is what it looks like anyway. We walked over there, heard a train whistle from the tracks a quarter mile or so away, and got spooked, but we weren't spooked enough to actually leave. So we were all wandering around, and my grandfather happens to be buried in this cemetery. Where the road split, they all wanted to go to the right, but I knew my grandpa's grave was to the left. I told everyone I'd catch up with them, I just wanted to check if he still had flowers on his grave, and if not, I'd go pick some up the next day. There is a small evergreen tree beside my grandpa's grave, roughly 7 feet tall or a little taller, and as I walked up to where I knew he was buried, I became very confused. There were 2 trees. I stopped walking about 75 yards from the grave itself, trying to figure out when they planted a second tree, when the second tree took a step towards me. I booked it and ran back the way I came, convinced the whole time something was about to grab me from behind. My friends got to the car shortly after me, and I told them what happened, and they said they noped out because one of them saw a deer that looked solid black. What I had seen had to have been at least the height of the other tree and looked plenty tree-like up until it took that step forward. It was super dark, so I didn't get the best look at it. I went back in the daytime the next day. There was only one tree by my grandpa's grave. I'm from Connecticut, and I grew up in a new house on old farmland in the 90s. My mother was a teacher, and my father was a police officer. When I was a kid, my dad worked odd hours and a ton of overtime, so it was pretty typical for me to hear him coming home at all hours of the night. I'd hear the fridge open as he got a late night/early morning snack, and I'd go back to sleep. I slept at the end of a long hallway, my little brother's bedroom on my right and my parents' bedroom on my left. I always slept with the door open and a nightlight on. The hallway itself was usually pitch black and didn't get much light. I don't recall specifically when this started, because at first I was not concerned, but I had to be between the ages of 8 and 12. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching me, and I would look through my open bedroom door and see a black figure silently standing there. It's hard to explain, but the figure was blacker than black, darker than the dark it was standing in, and it was tall. My dad has dark skin, I am biracial, so I just told myself it was him pacing the halls at night. Maybe he got home after a long shift and was having a tough time getting back to sleep. After a few nights of this, I knew something was wrong. The featureless shadow would walk to the end of the hallway and stare at me and then turn around and go the other way, and it never made any noise. I didn't really have the words for it, but I knew something was up, so I asked my mom, and she said it was probably just my dad getting up to get a glass of water. Part of me knew that wasn't what was going on, but being a kid, I didn't know how to advocate that her explanation didn't feel right. Also, being a kid, I decided to take my mom's word for it. I decided I must just be seeing my dad, so in order to prove it to myself, next time it happened I would say hi to him and he would say hi back. Mystery solved. The shadow figure pacing wasn't every single night, but it happened often enough that when I woke up feeling like someone was watching me, I could be pretty certain the figure was standing there staring at me. The next time I saw it, I foolhardily sat up in bed and said, "Hi Dad," and my blood ran cold, and I froze as this thing just stared at me for about 10 seconds and turned around down the hall. I knew it wasn't my dad. In the morning, I told my mother that I saw my dad in the hallway last night, but he didn't say anything back to me when I said hi. My mom responded by telling me that my dad wasn't home all night, he had been working overtime. I kept waiting for my mom to realize that something weird was going on, but she wasn't open to the possibility that what I was telling her was true. I know I tried to tell my mother about this shadow figure several times, but it was dismissed as my imagination or just a bad dream. When I brought it up to my dad, he didn't seem to believe me either. Eventually he gave me a religious patron saint necklace, I can't remember who, that he said would protect me, but my mom wouldn't let me sleep with it because she thought it was a choking hazard. My mom was a little overprotective, but apparently not from the supernatural. Now, here's where the story gets even weirder. The last time I saw this shadow figure, if it was the same thing, it wasn't a shadow. I woke up in the middle of the night, as usual, to the feeling that I was being watched, and standing there was a white-gray transparent man with a suit and a hat on. He stared at me and then dissipated into a mist. I screamed for my mother, and she told me I was just having a nightmare or seeing a shadow from the street. Sure. I spent most nights sweating with my blankets pulled over my head, refusing to look into the hallway after that, no matter how much I could feel that someone was watching me. The fear was so real that if I had to get up to go to the bathroom, I would just wait until the morning or sprint to the bathroom and then stay there until I saw light peeking through the window. I had trouble sleeping until I was 12, and we moved out of the house. I was scared the shadow figure would follow me to our new house, but it didn't. I still have nightmares about it to this day, and I avoid sleeping in pitch black rooms. I have no idea if this is true, but based on his story and my own experience, I wonder if this thing is attracted to grief or depression. You see, my dad had a drinking problem when I was growing up, I wasn't the happiest kid, and my mom never knew if my dad was really working late or out on a bender. I can imagine a negative energy being drawn to all of the sadness in our old house. The shadow figure never entered my room, and I also wonder if there was simply too much light in there for it. I had a big window facing the street, even if the blinds were closed, the street lights would brighten the room. It always stopped in my door frame, the light seemed to be a kind of barrier it couldn't cross. I don't know really, these are just my guesses and superstitions. I was haunted by a black humanoid figure when I was pregnant. So 4 years ago, in what many would call a ghetto suburb on my island, New Providence, Bain Town. I lived with my mom, 2 younger sisters, and my boyfriend of 5 years. It was a very small, 3-bedroom wooden house, located off the road behind some trees and bushes. So one day, in January 2017, my boyfriend, Jackson, then 23 years old, and I, Jalissa, then 21 years old, decided to try for a baby. We said to ourselves that we both have steady jobs, we're young but well off age to be responsible to bring this child into this world well loved and protected. So it didn't take long for me to become pregnant. As soon as I found out that for sure I was pregnant, I was excited, and I only told Jackson that we would be expecting. So for the first month or two, things were pretty normal for me. Besides for some morning sickness, well, I assume it was. Because I had no idea what that felt like, this being my first pregnancy. Just an upset stomach most days and nausea. So by the 3rd month, my stomach was not yet visibly growing or showing, so not even my mom or sisters had known that I was pregnant as yet. It's not that I didn't want to share the good news, but we have this saying or superstition in my country that women shouldn't let anyone know that they are expecting until they are at least 6 months along. In doing so before 6 months, they would risk bringing bad luck upon their unborn that can or may lead to a miscarriage. Pretty intense, I know, but for some reason I was obeying this saying. So I'm 3 months pregnant, and I just came home from work at around 8 p.m. My mom and sisters were home, my mom in her room and my younger sisters in their shared room. So, I get to my room shared with Jackson. He was still at work, which was positioned more to the back of our house. Keeping in mind the whole house was surrounded by tall trees and bushes, I only had one window in my room, and the view was trees and bushes. So, I'm doing my regular routine, changing clothes and getting ready for bed, when I notice my curtain open and what looked like these wide eyes just staring at me from behind some bushes. It was pretty dark, but it didn't look like a person or animal, just some floating eyes. So I stepped closer to my window, and it had disappeared. I didn't think anything of it, I figured I was just worn out and needed to get some rest. So this happened for about several days, with these wide eyes staring at me through my window apparently getting closer and closer to the house. I started to keep my window locked and curtains closed always. I assumed this was just my body going through changes and anxiety of being pregnant, causing me to now see things that were not there. So one night Jackson and I were asleep when all of a sudden I woke up and I had this feeling that something or someone was watching me. I sat up in bed and looked around my room. There was nothing. So I laid back down and went back to sleep. The next night in bed with my boyfriend, I again woke up and had the same feeling. This time I saw somewhat of a shadow in a corner of my room. I'm thinking, what can this be? There was no light in my dark room to cause a cast shadow of any object in here. I watched it for a while, and there was no movement. I was pretty tired, so again I laid back down and went to sleep. The following night, same thing happens, but now I awoke to a dark, about 8 feet tall, slouched humanoid figure that appeared to have no face, standing in the same corner of my room. I immediately woke up my boyfriend and told him what I saw, and he got up and turned on the lights. Now it was not there. My boyfriend comforted me, and we went back to sleep with the lights left on. The very next night, I was awakened by this force pulling on my arm until I was yanked up in my bed by my arm. I was now afraid and woke my boyfriend up, and I'm crying. Again, he stayed up with me until I fell to sleep. By now, I'm terrified for nights to arrive. The following night, I'm sleeping behind my boyfriend. Our bed was leaned against a wall, so I'm behind him against this wall. I woke up again in the middle of the night, and this figure again appeared in a corner of my room. This thing started to walk slowly over to me. I was frozen in fear and could not move. I just stared at this thing walking over to me. This thing leaned over my boyfriend and touched my stomach. I screamed and woke everyone up in the house. My boyfriend jumped up, and my mom and sisters ran over to our room to see what was happening. After my family noticed it was no intruder and I assured them I was okay, they went back to bed. I was livid yet started crying to my boyfriend. I had had enough. I told him I needed help, and we needed to see our local pastor/priest right there and then. It was now after 11 p.m. in the night, almost midnight. I had no idea if the pastor would be at the church, but I knew I just had to check. Surprisingly, the pastor, was there. My boyfriend and I ran in the church, and she said to me, I was expecting someone. I normally don't stay back in the church so late, but I knew you were coming. She then prayed for me, applied anointing oil to my head, and comforted me. She then proceeded to ask my boyfriend, if there was anyone that did not like Jalissa, someone you may have told that she was pregnant? Keep in mind, I was still not showing pregnancy and had not told the pastor. I was shocked. No one had come to mind of my boyfriend right there and then, so the pastor just gave me some anointed oil and instructed me to spread the oil in my room. We went back home and did just that. From that night on, I had no more encounters with this thing. A few months later, my boyfriend remembered that he had actually told one of his friends that I was expecting just out of excitement for his first child. Comes to find out, this male friend of his had a girlfriend that had lost a baby by miscarriage a few months before my girlfriend would have told him that I was expecting. This friend was then later found out to be into some dark stuff. My boyfriend had cut ties with him. I went on to have a normal, healthy pregnancy, and we now have a beautiful toddler. We call her Jay for short. Maybe that old saying is true, perhaps you're not supposed to inform others of your pregnancy during the early stages? Maybe in fear for something even worse happening, like a haunting of you and your unborn child? So, to set the story up, I was about 10 years old, and my family and I lived in a house in Southern California. New housing development, so no old creepy house to be had. It was a day of no consequence really, but what happened later that night into the next morning has stuck with me. I had been sleeping just fine when I was woken up by an aggressive whisper, best way I can describe it. I had my bed positioned against the wall, and I always slept towards it, so when I woke up to this, I simply opened my eyes and stayed still. There was a small lava lamp that was still on, so I had some dim light in the room. When I looked up on the wall, I could see a faint shadow that seemed to loom over me. I then heard another whisper, but it became more of a whispered shout. I was petrified and continued to stay still. The shadow on the wall seemed to be almost fluid. It was not a completely solid form, but I felt a clear oppressive presence over me. The whispers and shouts alternated for what seemed like ages. I couldn't get to sleep for obvious reasons, and I am not quite sure when this thing left, but it was probably about 40 minutes before it did. When I was brave enough to turn over and look at my clock on my nightstand, I saw it was just about 2 in the morning. The presence was gone. The shadow and whispers were gone. And I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Fast forward about 18 years, and my father and I were watching some random ghost hunting program. I never told anyone about this incident but brought it up since it had come to mind. After I explained the story to my dad, he mentioned a similar experience, possibly the same night it was for me. He had seen a dark form standing in the doorway of his and my mom's room. He stated the only way it seemed to leave him was when he held his necklace that was a medallion of Saint Michael and began praying. So, if anyone has any clue what this may have been, I would love to know, as it has always been something that I wanted an answer to or maybe even debunk. Glenbeulah Cemetery. My parents were really into paranormal activity shows and claimed they had had encounters as well. Anyway, one night they decided they wanted to go to one of the most haunted cemeteries in Wisconsin to check it out, so we packed up the car and headed to Glenbeulah Cemetery, also known as Walnut Grove Cemetery. After about a 2-hour drive, we started to pull down the windy road that ended at the cemetery, only to find there were people already there. It must have been close to 11 p.m. when we got there, and when we pulled up to the gate, the people approached our car and told us that we needed to leave due to it being private property, and we didn't have permission to be there. My parents apologized and told them they just wanted to check it out because it was known as one of the most haunted places in Wisconsin and told them that's we'd leave, but just as we were about to turn around, one of the men stopped us and told us that they were a paranormal activity investigation team and offered for us to join them for the night, and we agreed. As we started, they placed a few flashlights with fresh batteries around the cemetery. They explained to us that if there were any spirits around, they would draw the energy from the flashlight, and we would know if they were there. After about 20 minutes, the flashlights would start flickering and then turn off. This happened a few times throughout the night, and each time the batteries were drained. Nothing crazy, but we were intrigued. One of the stories from the cemetery is that some people see a childlike figure peeking out from behind a tree or sometimes playing. So the team we were with put out a red ball that my child would play with. This ball was at the bottom of a small hill, and I shit you not, we were all standing around, and this ball began rolling up the hill. There was no wind or anything that could have rolled this ball uphill. I couldn't believe it. At some point one of the guys we were with took us to one of the headstones at the back of the cemetery, where he played a voice recorder, I believe that's what it was anyway, in reverse to get that static noise you see in the ghost shows. He began asking questions with nothing until he asked for a certain name. I wish I could remember the name, and we finally heard something abnormal but nothing crazy. He then asked if this was name, and it responded yes. We could have believed what we were hearing. He then asked when he was born, and you could hear the old man's voice say the year. Once again, I really wish I could remember, but I was a kid. It was unbelievable. You only ever hear or see this stuff on TV shows, but to be there in person hearing it was insane. The spirit eventually stopped talking, and suddenly I felt something touch me, and a flash of a red orb went by, which everyone else saw. Then one of the flashlights sitting on a stone that had died a while before began flashing again, and as soon as someone went to touch it, it stopped and wouldn't turn back on. Being pretty freaked out, we decided to take a break and go hang out by the trucks for a minute and have a soda. Well, I was following everyone. I was in the back. I had turned around to look back at where we just were to see the child peering around the tree at me. I screamed, and it disappeared, and everyone turned around, asking what was wrong, but I didn't know what to even say. I was scared out of my mind. So we all end up at our trucks just hanging out for a minute, just talking and telling stories and whatnot, and then one of the guys decided that we should all go check out all the old gravestones. As we were checking them out, he told us to be quiet and listen as he asked questions to the dead and was basically trying to get them to do something. While he was doing this, he had me put on a headset that amplified sound around you. Well, a little time goes on, and suddenly I see one of those red orbs again off in the woods. I believe they called them red eye or eyes, and is quickly gone. I was a little freaked out but didn't say anything because I didn't want to ruin whatever was going on when all of a sudden I feel something cold on my neck and hear someone, or something, whisper my name. I looked at my mom because I thought maybe C was trying to ask me something, and I just couldn't hear her right because of the headset, but C wasn't even looking in my direction. I took a few steps when suddenly I heard my name again. This time it was loud and stern into the headset, and I looked up to see a manly figure running at me. I threw the headset off and started crying and freaking out. I didn't have the words to say what had just happened to anyone there with me. I was uncontrollably freaking the duck out. My parents decided we needed to get hell out of there, and we left. Up until that day, I never really believed in that stuff, but the things I saw and heard that night were far from imagination. It was one of the scariest, most unexplainable things I have ever experienced. Ever since that night I've had unexplainable encounters and sometimes believe that something might have attached to me that night, if that makes any sense. This is something that I didn't talk about for a long time because I didn't think anyone would believe me, but here I am to finally tell me a story from that night. I'd like to hear some of the crazy paranormal encounters y'all have had. And BTW, if you hear knocking in the night and think there's nothing, there probably is. I am no longer skeptical. My wife and I stayed at an Airbnb that was a house built in 1901 in an old mining town in Arizona. The experiences we had made us leave a day early at 3:30 a.m. The town is called Bisbee, Arizona. It's a small town tucked into the mountains near the Mexican border, less than 20 miles away from the famed town of Tombstone. I'll give a brief history, but if you ever want to fall down an internet rabbit hole, the town's full history is pretty fascinating. Copper and other valuable minerals were discovered there in 1877, and a mining camp sprung up. The population swelled significantly over the next couple decades, and at one point it was bigger than San Francisco. The problem was that they crammed this population into what is effectively a canyon. The town is literally built into the sides of the canyon, with front door steps leading to your neighbor's roof in the lot below. With the population surge came crime, disease, sanitation issues, etc., not to mention the toxic fumes and smoke that came with the mining operations. People were making money hand over fist while living in absolute squalor and misery for quite some time. They mined there continuously until 1974 and dug one of the largest open pit mines in America. When the copper ran out, the mining company up and left and basically sold the whole town back to the townspeople, and they turned it into a fun, artsy, hippie party town. Some world-renowned artists live there, including the comedian Doug Stanhope. This year was the third year in a row my wife and I had gone down there for the 4th of July. The trip has become sort of a tradition. This year we stayed at an Airbnb that was a house built in 1901. It was actually one of the first houses built on the main street through town. I'd like to preface that overall I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I've always found it entertaining, but felt that ultimately it was probably bullshit. My wife also felt the same way. It would take a very concrete experience for me to fully believe. Well, let me tell you about my experiences over the past couple days and nights that changed my outlook quite a bit. So the first evening we were there, we were just kind of milling about deciding what we were going to do for the evening. I was in the kitchen, and I distinctly heard footsteps on the hardwood floors. I absolutely thought my wife was walking up behind me and even felt the presence of someone there. I turned around, and there was no one there, and she was lying in bed on her phone. We chalked it up to leftover thunder from a storm that had just passed, or maybe old plumbing. Later that night, when we were getting into bed, we were plugging our phones in and testing out light switches and such. I switched my light on, and we both heard a weird scratching sound on in the wall. I even jokingly said, "Damn, I hope that's not wires arcing in the wall or something." It definitely wasn't wires arcing, as I am familiar with that sound. But the sound was definitely along the same lines. The next morning at breakfast, my wife mentions that she had trouble sleeping because of very vivid and intense nightmares that took place in the house. She said they were those types of dreams where you're not sure if you're awake or asleep. It was enough to visibly shake her, and she's not an easily shaken woman. The next night rolls around, last night, and we go to bed around 10 p.m. or so. I drifted off to sleep for what felt like maybe 30 minutes or so before I was woken up by multiple itchy/ticklish feelings all over my body. At first I chalked it up to my sensitive skin against sheets I'm not used to. I've had that happen before, but this time it was different. Every time I would scratch the spot where I had the feeling, it would instantly move to another part of my body. It felt like someone was intentionally trying to aggravate me. I also had slept in the same bed a few times before this with no issue. Dealing with this made me toss and turn for a couple hours until I finally had it and got up to find my wife awake as well. She was having the same nightmares as the night before. And I couldn't sleep. She also had a deep uneasiness about the mirrors hung around the house. Now that we were awake, she went out on the porch to have a smoke, and I stayed in bed scrolling through my phone, and while I was doing this, I saw a person walk across the foot of my bed out of the corner of my eye. I also felt the presence of someone walking in. The airflow from the AC even changed slightly. It was vivid enough that I 110% thought it was my wife walking in, and my stomach sank like a rock when I realized she was still out on the porch. I thought it might have been a glare from my phone, but I tried every which way to recreate it and was unable to. Both of us being unable to sleep, we started talking about stuff. Now mind you, we rarely if ever argue or fight, and we definitely don't get angry and things don't get heated. Especially over topics like the ones we were discussing. As the conversation went on, this weird negative energy started to develop, and the conversation started turning south. We both kind of snapped out of it, thought about the events leading up to this, and decided to pack up and nope TF out of there. As we were leaving, my wife went back in to grab one last thing and heard multiple footsteps around her and had the distinct feeling she was being chased out. We drove back to Tucson in the dead of night and are both still sitting here in a state of shock about what we experienced. I have always experienced paranormal things, and my earliest memory of anything paranormal was age 4. I have many stories of things I've witnessed in my lifetime, but this is one from my time living in rural Missouri. In 2009, I moved in with my boyfriend, now husband, and his family. They lived in a beautiful farmhouse on several acres of land. The nearest neighbor was probably half a mile down the road, so it was very quiet. This home has a large basement that was basically a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's where my husband and I lived. As soon as I moved in, I started to notice strange sounds and see things. I didn't mention these things to him because I didn't want him to think I was crazy. It would take me a long while to type out every single instance of what we witnessed, but I'll tell you the ones that still scare me today when I think back. Right outside of our bedroom door was a long hallway that led to the staircase and another bedroom. We were the only 2 people to ever go into the basement. One night we were already in bed and watching TV. We began to hear extremely heavy footsteps pacing up and down the hallway. It was so heavy that we thought maybe someone had broken into the house and was wearing heavy work boots or something. We turned the television off and started to listen closely. It would pass by our door and seem to go towards the end of the hall and then would come back near the door. At this point, our dog was growling and looking towards the door. With the TV off, the bedroom was pitch black and dark. My husband called out hello. The sound of the boots stopped. He started to text his mother, the only other person home that night. He asked her if she was downstairs. She responded that she was sleeping. My husband started to get up and find out who was in the house. He made it about halfway to the door, and all of a sudden it literally flew open. It was such a force that the knob knocked a small hole in the wall. At that point our dog went crazy and was barking and ran to hide under a table. The bedroom was still extremely dark, so my husband tried to hurry and turn the lights on. Lights come on. Silence. He runs into the hallway, looking around. We both searched the entire basement and found nothing. One night we are sitting in the living room area in the basement watching television. Behind the living room area was a kitchen area that had a long bar. We had a few bar stools up on the bar and a telephone on a charger. This particular night we were the only ones at home as everyone else had gone out to dinner. We start to hear a weird sound, almost like someone was moving furniture across the floor. We lower the volume on the TV so we can hear things better. We hear something moving again. All of a sudden we hear a very loud crashing sound right behind the couch. We then feel something hit the back of the couch. We both jumped up terrified and looked behind us. 2 of the bar stools that were on the bar are now on the floor behind the couch. Keep in mind the kitchen area sat back about 14 or 15 feet from where the couch is. If they simply fell somehow, there was no possible way they traveled like that. The phone that was on the other end of the bar was about 10 feet away on the floor and ripped from the charger. We looked around, and we literally ran up the stairs and outside until we could calm down. I was absolutely terrified and feared the basement after that. We started to see what looked like a possible shadow figure standing in the doorway. Each time we would see it, it was just standing there and would slowly move away. It got to the point that we would try to ignore it until it went away. We told his mom and stepdad. They told us that they saw and heard things frequently, too. We would be upstairs and hear the toilet flush in the bathroom. We would then hear the water in the sink turn on, then silence. At night, if we would come upstairs and walk through the house while lights were off, you would just feel as though you were being watched. We made the mistake of trying to hold a seance one evening. We wanted to ask and see what was there, or maybe what they wanted. We were sitting in the kitchen upstairs in the main part of the house. There is an arched doorway to exit the kitchen, and just to the right as you walk through the arched doorway are the stairs leading back down into the basement. As we are asking if anyone would like to talk to us, we hear what sounds like someone running up the stairs from the basement. It was very heavy footsteps. His mom and little sister were with us at the table. We all 4 jumped up scared as hell. We all looked at the doorway to see who was coming up those stairs. As soon as it seemed like it was nearing the top of the stairs, it went silent. We all had to go outside until we were calmed and had the courage to come back inside. These are just a few examples out of many more things that we witnessed while living there. I asked my husband if he had noticed any of these things happening before now. He said that things happened, but nowhere near as bad as once I moved in. His mother told me the same thing. We ended up going to the library and speaking with a local historian. She told us that in the late 70s, a young woman had committed suicide in the home, in the basement. She told us that a young woman who lived in the home had become very depressed. She hung herself in the area right by the basement kitchen. Immediately things started to make sense. While I was growing up, I had a spirit that basically watched over me while I was at home. Ever since I was a baby, he was always around me. I called him the farmer, but I can't honestly tell you why. The name just came to me and stuck. But I can say that my property used to be a field, and I have found super old and rusted nails and hinges for barn doors in our small horse pasture. These items were always basically made of rust, far too weathered to be from our own tiny barn. But, anyway, the farmer always appeared as a shadow on the wall in human form, never a solid mass or mist. However, his shadow would appear and move in places where nobody else would be, so it was never anybody else's shadow I would see. Sometimes, while I would watch TV down in our basement, he would stand behind the couch and myself. The hair on the back of my neck would stand on end at the feeling of his presence there, even if I wasn't scared. It was kind of like how static electricity would make your hair stand up if you rubbed a balloon on your head. That sort of feeling. He followed me all throughout the house but never left the property itself. When I'd go to my room or the bathroom, he would wait outside at the doorway, but he never entered those two rooms. Instead, he stayed in front of the doorway like a sentry, waiting and guarding me. Now, I didn't know he was guarding me for a long time, but I grew up with him, so it was normal for me anyway. He never appeared for anyone else but me, but he did do things that couldn't easily be explained away that my parents witnessed. One instance was our stove light turning off. I had been in my room, unaware of anything going on outside of the personal space. My parents were in the bathroom, and the stove light in the kitchen was on. However, when exiting the bathroom, they found it to be off. Switched off, the knob physically having been turned. They questioned me about it, but I told the truth that it hadn't been me, and I was too short to reach the light at the time anyway. I'm an only child, too, and nobody else had been in the house to do it. Another instance is while my mom was in bed, her doorknob started to turn. She's an extremely light sleeper, so she woke up to it and watched it in the dim light turn and just keep turning slowly. It never opened. She thought it was me coming in, at first, to tell her I was sick. But when the door never opened, she finally got up and opened it herself. Nobody was on the other side, and I was fast asleep in my bed. We also have outdoor acts that oftentimes come inside. Before anyone says anything, they were stray when we got them and get extremely stressed when inside for too long, so they have to live outside. Still, they're spayed and neutered and are up to date on their shots, even back then. Anyway, it was a spring or summer day when I was maybe 13, and our cat Daryl comes trotting through the kitchen. The funny thing is, we knew all of our cats had been outside, and my mom and I were the only ones home. We were unpacking groceries in the kitchen, so we definitely had not let the cat in. Yet, somehow, the door had opened just long enough to let him inside. Also, it happened without us hearing it, but we were certain he had been outside beforehand. When I was 14, the farmer stopped being so frequent at the house and staying with me. One day, I was going down to the basement to go watch some TV and relax. However, I didn't make it the whole way down the stairs. Before going further, I have to explain that my basement-way staircase goes straight down for about 14 steps. Then, you get to a little landing and turn left to finish off 3 more steps. I had made it to the landing and turned to step down, but I stopped in my tracks. I can honestly say I didn't see anything, but I felt it. Coming from the opposite corner was the strongest sense of hatred and danger I have ever felt in my life, even to this day. It felt like if I took one more step down into the basement, I could die. Yet I saw nothing. Then I got another feeling, a much more familiar one. I felt the presence of the farmer standing right in front of me, protecting me from whatever malicious force was in the other corner of the room. Needless to say, I bolted back up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, even locking it. After that, I stopped seeing or feeling the farmer for a long time. Years passed without anything. I fully believe he was my guardian angel and gave himself to protect me that day. He probably died as a farmer on the field my house was built on, but he was such a good soul and turned into my angel. Every now and again, my family and I experience different paranormal events. They're just small things, though. We're pretty sure we have a couple new spirits that stick around and a few that just pass through. But, every now and then, I like to think the farmer managed to come back for visits to check up on me and make sure I'm doing okay. Back in July of 2021, I had a demonic encounter. Before I give an overview of what happened, I want you to know that before this happened I grew up Catholic, but as I got older I drifted away from religion and stopped believing in anything like that. I'm only going to give a brief overview of what happened, because the whole ordeal lasted for a couple hours and I could write pages and pages explaining in detail what happened. I'm also not schizo or anything like that. I was also not on any drugs at all. I am 32 now, and I've only had this one experience in my life. I went to sleep that night at about midnight, and I woke up at 4 a.m. It was dark in my room, but I had the TV on, so there was the TV light, and I looked and saw everything on my dresser moving up and down. It looked like a poltergeist. I was so freaked out by this and shaking. I had a Texas Longhorn skull on my wall next to the dresser, and it was shaking. I stood up to go turn the light on, and a translucent orb came out of the area where the longhorn was on the wall, and it flew right through me. When it went through me, I immediately felt vertigo. I felt weak and lightheaded. I turned the light on, and the orb that went through me formed into what looked like an average 6 feet tall Caucasian man except for the face. There were no eyes. The eye sockets were empty, and the mouth went from ear to ear with sharp pointy teeth and a long snake-like tongue. It was telling me that it was going to kill me, and it wanted my soul. I stood in shock, but then out of my closet walked out a translucent version of my sister's friend, but it was like a demonic version of her. I know this sounds bizarre, but this really happened. The two of the entities that I was seeing were talking to each other, and I tried recording on my phone, and when I pulled my phone out, it literally just powered down. Like the thing was powering down my phone. They walked towards me, and I took off running out of the house as they came after me. I ended up going to my neighbor's house, which is kind of far as I live in a more rural area. I pounded on the door, and basically what ended up happening was the police were called and the ambulance. They thought I was hallucinating on drugs, so they took me to the hospital, and they said my heart rate was so high. When I got to the hospital, they injected me with a lot of Ativan, and I passed out. When I woke hours and hours later, I found out that they ran all these tests on me and found no drugs whatsoever in my system, and then they had thought that maybe I was schizo, which later found out that I am not and have no history of psychosis or anything like that. When I got out, I immediately called my sister's friend because I knew what I saw was real. She refused to talk to me on the phone. A few weeks later I saw her at a party, and we went outside by ourselves, and she told me when no one was around to hear that what I saw was a demon and her alter ego. She said it was real, and I didn't explain what the demon looked like, and she explained verbatim what it looked like. Then people came out, and she wouldn't say any more. After that, I lost touch with her, and my sister isn't friends with her anymore. I have no way to contact her. I found out though that she was dabbling in some sort of witchcraft and that she's really dark now. As time has gone on, I want answers as to what this was exactly, and I will know more. I lost my dad when I was young, and I swear on his grave that I'm not lying at all. I don't tell people about this because whenever I do, they think I'm crazy or lying. I'm wondering if anyone possibly has any answers at all. I now know for certain that there is another realm that we can't see. I'm here to tell you that demons are real. I wasn't a believer until I saw it for myself. Both my twin sister and I were divorced, so we moved in together to share expenses and raise our children. I worked days, and she worked evenings, so one of us was always available if we were needed. She was a radiological tech in the emergency room, and one evening she called me at around 10:50 p.m., crying. She said she had the heaviest feeling of fear and dread. She was getting ready to clock out for the night but was scared to come home. I asked all the usual questions, but she had no explanations. Nothing unusual happened during her shift. They had a full staff, so the exams were completed timely, which made the patients and physicians happy, etc. However, the anxiety and fear set in about 30 minutes before she called me, and it got to the point where she actually cried. This was totally out of the norm for her. Seriously, she was our rock, she was our warrior and champion. I told her to sit in her car, smoke a couple of cigarettes, listen to the radio, and when she felt better, drive home. If that didn't help, keep sitting there, but call back so I wouldn't worry more than I already was. After we hung up, I walked to the kitchen for a drink of water. My two cats were sitting on the couch, and I said, "Boys, we gotta send positive vibes to my sister. She's really scared." They lost their minds. They jumped up, their legs running in the air, like in Looney Tunes, screaming and crying. They climbed the curtains, ran across the curtain rod, photos fell off the walls, and the shade on the front door window fell off and hit the floor. They ran through the kitchen to the back part of the house and out the pet door. I was standing there thinking, WTF just happened? When the phone rang. She said she had just reached the car, she was fine, the fear was gone, it just vanished, like poof, and she was on her way home. I don't know how many people will listen to this or how many will believe it, and frankly, I don't care. I know that this really happened, my brother knows it, and even local law enforcement believes some of it. This happened on a ranch that my brother and I lease in eastern Montana. The ranch in question is massive, covering about 18 sections. A section is 1 square mile, or 640 acres, and is 2/3 deeded, with the rest being either BLM or state-owned. This land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, where hundreds of years ago the Indians would chase herds of buffalo off cliffs to their deaths. You can still find buffalo bones at these sites. Supposedly the ranch was also the site of a massacre, where an entire village of Hidatsa were killed by their enemies, the Sioux, although I haven't found any actual records of that incident. Also on the ranch are 2 abandoned homesteads on the ranch, the Mint Place and the Carter Place. These are fake names as the families still live in the area and I would like to keep their information private. The Mint Homestead is merely 1 mile off of a county road and relatively easy to access, so my brother and I still use the dated cattle pens that are a part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only being accessible on horseback as the trail that went to it washed out many years ago. All that is left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with the roof caving in, an old corral system, and a barn that has toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house were the Carter family themselves, but during the 1930s the father went crazy and ended the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least that's what people said. The ranch's current owners live in California and have owned the ranch since purchasing it from the Mint family sometime during the 1980s. My brother and I began leasing the ranch in 2007. There was some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The strangeness began in 2017, after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for stray animals on horseback when I was approached by 2 frantic hunters. These hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive, as there had not been a wolf in this area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed that they knew the difference between wolves and coyotes and were absolutely certain that what was stalking them was wolves. Whatever the creature was, it had seriously disturbed them. Later in the year, when we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place, we found out that we were a dozen heads short. Despite us running 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd, and it was unusual to lose more than 2. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we could not find the missing cattle. This began a trend, and so far since 2017 there have been a total of 138 unaccounted cattle, a financial loss of $165,000. Though there are many odd events that I could recount, there is one that stands out. This took place in October of 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them to the Mint homestead, where they could be loaded on trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this point the weird activity on the ranch had increased, so much so that we never went to the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception, and strapped to the saddle under my left leg was a Winchester 30-30 rifle. The morning went well, and by noon we had gathered 200 heads, which we penned up at the Mint place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down a canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I cannot describe what these howls sounded like, because they were like nothing I had heard before or since. As I continued riding in the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse, Ace, seemed to pick up on this as well and began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he was usually a quiet and collected horse. The second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of the old log cabin and ran in the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lenses chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive and solid black. It was so large that it could be mistaken for a black bear, but it was undeniably canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around and come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that the wolf I saw was nothing more than a coyote and that its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived back at the Mint place, herding 30 heads of cattle in front of me. After I penned the cattle up, I led Ace back to my pickup and horse trailer. From a distance I could see there was something wrong with the trailer, and as I approached I found that the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me as it was fine when I drove in, and there was no explanation as to what could have made it come apart when it wasn't moving. By this time it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer and leave Ace at the corrals overnight. When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters, so I continued driving. I also heard some more of the howls I had heard earlier in the day. When all 3 of us arrived the next morning, we found the corrals in a total mess. All the grass was turned up inside the corrals where the cattle had been milling, and the fence was broken in several places. The cattle that were penned up the night before were nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on horseback to try to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but only managed to find around 20 heads. As I was without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later in the afternoon. The next day all 3 of us rode, and we searched exclusively for Ace. During this time I covered a lot of country that I would have otherwise missed, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one canyon were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 3 feet deep. These holes had to have been dug by people, as there would be no animal that would have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were the carcasses of 4 cows, all piled on top of each other, in an area that they typically would not have accessed. At first I thought that this was the active poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch, but there would have been no way to get to this location with a pickup or a four-wheeler, for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense everything made. We searched for 3 days before we came across something. My brother radioed me, as there was no cell service, that he believed he had found Ace. My nephew and I rode to his location, and sure enough at the bottom of a sinkhole, sinkholes are very common in this area, so its presence was not unusual, was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of a canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet tall and the sinkhole being another 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon walls. When I finally approached the sinkhole, I found Ace to be heavily mutilated. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes, nostrils, and ears. The back half of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail was also removed. The cows surrounding him also had similar mutilations. As was the case with the howls, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for just 1 cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading into or out of the sinkhole or canyon. The sheriff and veterinarian were both notified, and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to spook and break out of the corrals, and whatever it was spooked them so bad that they ran all the way from Mint Place to the bottom of the sinkhole, in which they perished. When I mentioned the wolf I had seen, they were dismissive, just as I had been when the hunters told me of the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected, and the case was closed. Though there were many strange things that have happened since then, there were none quite as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continued to go missing, and we now only ride the place in pairs. My brother and I are thinking about terminating the lease, as for the moment the current cattle losses are unsustainable. When I turned 20, I got my first apartment in the basement of a 3-story house with 3 apartments. The apartment was a 2-bedroom apartment with a funny bathroom that reminded you more of a closet. From the bathroom there was a dark bedroom with a terrace door that led you out to an underground terrace and a large garden. Next to the bedroom there was a living room, also with a terrace door to the underground terrace. The first night I moved in, I had my 3-year-old brother and my 2 other siblings over for dinner. My 3-year-old brother slept over. I had just tucked him to bed and went to turn off the light. But when I turned around, I saw a dark-haired woman with a lilac cardigan walk past me and then disappear. She didn't look at me, and I, weirdly enough, didn't feel scared. I shrugged it up to being my imagination and just went on with my evening. Next morning, my brother told me that I had a ghost in my apartment and that she was very nice. I never mentioned anything to him about what I saw, so I was a bit surprised. When I spoke with my 2 other siblings, they said that they felt watched when they had to walk up the stairs from my apartment and had been talking about it on their way home. After that episode I would feel watched and a bit unnerved in the night, but I shrugged it off to me being paranoid because I needed to get used to living alone. So I bought kittens to keep me company in my apartment. I started noticing my cat food, bread, and other dry foods would start to mold from the bottom of the bag and upwards, so I thought that there was mold in the kitchen, so I moved the food to the top closets, but the issue would continue. My kittens would often sit in the hallway between the kitchen, bedroom, and living room and stare towards the bedroom while their tails would move back and forth. These were little things that I never thought more about, I just let them sit there and stopped having any food outside my refrigerator. However, one night I was sleeping in my bed with my 2 kittens next to me. Suddenly I awoke and felt very paranoid. My 2 kittens both stood up on top of me completely stiff and looked intently in the top corner of the room by the door to the hallway. I looked and saw nothing but darkness, but I felt very frightened. I tried to calm down my kittens, but they would not sit down or anything and started softly hissing. I stood up, grabbed the kittens, and ran out of the bedroom. I closed the door to the bedroom and called my sister to calm me a bit down. I again said it was nothing, but I did not feel comfortable sleeping in the bedroom, so I kept the door closed and slept in the living room instead. My kittens would still sit in front of the door and watch it intently. Every time I had to go to the bathroom, I would feel so paranoid and rush to get out of there again. I started hearing noises from the apartment on top of mine but found out that nobody was living there, and it did not sound like mice, it sounded like weird bumps, like somebody jumping in different areas upstairs. The ones living in the top apartment were alcoholics and never noticed anything in the house, I know from speaking with them. Anyway, one night, I had just laid down to fall asleep in the living room. I was lying on my side, and all of a sudden I heard a hollow hello in my ear, and a chill breeze blew on my neck and ear. I sat up and looked around, and nothing was there but the cats, sitting and watching the terrace door. I did not sleep that night and kept analyzing how the voice sounded. It sounded unfamiliar, very hollow, and a bit manly, and I was completely awake when it happened, so it was not a dream. I went to visit some friends, and my sister called me to ask if she could sleep in my apartment that night. I said sure, but late that night she called me, scared, complaining about noises and feeling watched. I talked to her, and she eventually fell asleep. When I got home, again I was worn out and took a nap on the couch. During my nap, I was dreaming that a black figure was walking slowly over the lawn in the garden, towards my underground terrace. I was terrified of the figure in the dream as it got closer and closer. A sort of ringing noise like a high pressure started to come, and I woke up with a loud bang. I looked in horror as my 2 terrace doors both had blown up and broken their locks simultaneously. I walked out on the terrace, and there was no wind, everything was weirdly silent. I freaked out and moved over to my dad's for a couple of days. When I got back, my mother stayed in my apartment for some days because she was moving to a new house that was too messy to sleep in. My mom did not believe my stories about my apartment, so she wanted to sleep in the bedroom. I was sitting in the living room with my little brother, while my mom was sleeping in the bedroom. All of a sudden, we started hearing weird noises from the bedroom. It sounded like a small goblin singing a taunting tune. Turns out it came from my mother. We were standing and looking at her in horror while she was sleeping while singing in that weird tune. We woke her up, and she said that we were acting silly and got angry when we told her about what happened. Just to clarify, my mom is a no bullshit kind of woman, so she would never prank us or anything of that sort. The next night we woke up hearing those noises from my mother again. When we walked over to wake her up, her voice changed to a deep male voice, and she was sort of yelling out weird words extremely fast. We got scared, and my brother started crying. She woke up because of our yelling. This time she believed us. She said she had been dreaming of a black figure in the room. I moved away from that apartment shortly after. Sometimes I walk by the house and wonder if some of the other renters experienced some of the things I did. I have noticed that the apartment has been up for rent many times after I left, knowing it was 8 years ago, and the apartment is unoccupied again. So I moved into my house 3 years ago. At first, I didn't think it was haunted. I got into a little trouble and got sentenced to 2 years in juvenile. I came back, and my dad told me that there's been weird things happening in the house. At first I didn't believe him. I thought he was crazy. Then this is when it happened. While in juvenile, I was handed a cross that was blessed. The priest told me I would need it soon. I left a week later and got released. I came home and always kept my cross around my neck on a chain. Then I decided to give it to my girl. I started to notice shadow people out the corner of my eyes, but I dismissed it. Then I was playing my Xbox one night, and I felt like someone was watching me, so I turned to the door thinking my dad was ducking with me, but I saw the shadow person. He was about 6 feet 8 inches and had no face. He gave me a nod and walked out. Thinking alright, that's weird. I went back to playing my game. Then I felt it again, so I looked, and there was a little girl about 7 to 8. She peeked around the corner then ran off, dress fluttering behind her. I wanted to get up and see if she was real, but I had cold chills, so I stayed put. I gave it a few days, then it happened again except she stayed there for about a minute smiling, only showing half her face. Her eyes looked like they were dead. Her eyes look like they've been dead for centuries. I told her I'm playing a game and I wasn't going to get up, so again, she ran away, dress fluttering behind her. About a week later, I was looking at our security cameras. She was outside leading a group of faceless figures. They came into the house and walked up the steps then disappeared. I told my dad about seeing them, and he said, "I told you. I feel the evil in this house, and I'm looking for a new place. I just hope they don't follow." Last night I was out with my dogs at about midnight, and I suddenly felt like someone was running up behind me. Startled, I turned around, and nothing was there. I felt scared, so I rushed inside but didn't think about it again until what just happened. Not sure if it's related. To give some context, it's 6:45 a.m. and I've already been up for 2 hours, so I'm not groggy and it's not cold here. I'm sitting on my couch with my 2 dogs, and I had my eyes closed, just relaxing, and I saw 3 bright circles, with my eyes still closed, and as the circles appeared, I felt something touch my head. I opened my eyes and lifted my hand to my head, but nothing. All of a sudden I felt very cold air moving through me, not all over though, almost like someone was holding a hose with cold air and was moving it around my face and body, but from the inside out. It went on for 10 minutes and freaked me out so much that I was asking whatever was there to leave me alone. It has stopped, but I am freezing now, like goosebumps and shivering under my blanket. It sounds so bizarre, but I felt terrified, and now I feel crazy. There aren't any drafts. And also, my 2 dogs didn't react, and one is lying on my lap. If anyone has any insight to put my mind at ease, I'd really love some. Thanks for listening if you stayed. My paranormal experience at the Northern State Mental Hospital. The events of this story are true. In October 2019, a group of 5 friends, Alex, Joey, Anakin, Sarah, and Rayana, and myself, Sam, wanted to do some spooky stuff for Halloween. We were all in the Army and stationed at JBLM in Washington State. We had just gotten back from a month-long field cycle in Fort Irwin, California, and wanted to have fun and blow off steam. We did some research on some haunted locations in Washington and found a few. 2 of the 3 were busts, the third was the Northern State Mental Hospital. On October 12th, we drove 120 miles to Sedro-Woolley, Washington, where the mental hospital is located. We really weren't expecting to see anything paranormal after the last 2 letdowns. When we got there, it was already late, about 7 o'clock at night. It was dark, not very many people were there, only like 2 other cars were in the lot. We passed a couple of people leaving, and they didn't say anything to us, they just walked to their car and left. On that day, it was just Alex, Joey, Anakin, and Sarah. We were equipped with flashlights and knives. We weren't taking any chances. We really had no idea where anything was until we found a map posted at the beginning of the hiking trail. We were closest to the old farm, and so we made our way up there. The trail we were on was extremely dark, and our flashlights were not very good, so we're already nervous about getting lost. When we got to the farm, it was obvious that the place was no longer an actual farm. All the buildings were collapsed and/or run down. We followed the path until it ended, and then we saw another group of people with flashlights. They were up on a hill that overlooked the farm. We didn't know who they were or how many of them were up there. Our first thought was it was some park rangers running off kids and amateur ghost hunters. It was at that moment that Alex and Joey said, "Hey, there's someone walking down the hill." I was right next to Joey and said, "Where?" "I don't see anyone," Alex said. "They're over there, they don't have a flashlight." It took me a little bit to see the person, but I eventually saw the person. All I could see of the person was a tall, stocky black figure. He was walking down the hill to a silo that was on the farm. We turned off our flashlights because we didn't know if it was a cop or a ranger, so we just stood there and watched the person. After the person disappeared behind the silo, we never saw him again. Sarah then came up and said, "Do you guys hear that?" We asked her what she was hearing. We didn't hear anything. She told us that she was hearing children or women crying. We then got ballsy and ventured into the barn closest to the trail. We looked around and didn't see anything. We didn't hear anything. On our way out of the barn, we noticed that the group of people that were on the hill had come down. So we went over to them and talked to them. We asked, "Hey, was that your friend that came down here a few minutes ago?" And they said no, we don't know who that was. They also said they didn't even see that person. Sarah then came back up to us and said she was hearing the crying again. Alex and Joey then went with the group that was on the hill to look for that person. I stayed with Anakin and Sarah. The 3 of us were joking around, smoking cigarettes, while Alex and Joey looked around. While Anakin and I talked about the guy we saw, Sarah walked back towards the barn. She stopped and stared at the barn for a minute and then came back over to us. When she spoke, I knew she was terrified. She said, "We need to leave right now. I keep hearing that crying, and it's freaking me out." Anakin and I were both like, "Sarah, we don't hear anything. Everything is fine." But Sarah was in full panic. She then told us, "I don't care if you guys stay here, but I'm going back to the car." Anakin and I agreed, he'll go with Sarah, and I'll wait for Alex and Joey. They left, and I watched for Alex and Joey. I lit another cigarette and waited. While standing there, I felt a sudden feeling of anxiety. I was alone in the dark in a suspected haunted place. I could see Alex and Joey, they were more in the middle of the farm now. I made my way over to them to see what they were looking at. They then told me what the other group told them. There is a crematorium over there and a cemetery on the hill. I was then a little more nervous about being there. I told them that Sarah was scared and wanted to leave. So we then headed back to the car and left. On the way home, I looked up the history of the hospital and the farm. To all of our surprise and shock, we discovered 3 things. 1. The Northern State Mental Hospital is the one most haunted place in Washington State. 2. The person we saw walking alone in the dark has been spotted before and was named the Man in Black, and that he was to be avoided at all costs. 3. The history of the things that happened at the hospital when it was new were not medical treatments, it was experimental lobotomies and torture. These facts made us want to go back and explore more during the day. So we decided that we should come back tomorrow during the day. The only person that didn't want to go back was Sarah, but she agreed to come with us the next day. On October 13th, Alex, Sarah, and I drove back up early so we could look around during the day. We were amazed to find out that around and on the farm was a disc golf course. We made the joke, I wonder if these people know how many people died here? We then hiked around a bit before coming to the crematorium. The building was completely run down and people had graffitied all over it, including some pretty vivid pentagrams. We all decided that we would avoid the crematorium at night. Joey had convinced his girlfriend Rayana, who was also in the army with us, to come along. When they showed up, it was already getting dark. I had bought a digital camera to see if I could take a picture of the man in black. He ultimately did not show up again. Sarah heard the crying again coming from the barn. She was always the only one who could hear it. She then told us that she was seeing a woman wearing a white dress. She said she was watching Sarah and then disappeared behind a barn. We didn't believe Sarah, so we would go over to where Sarah had said she had seen the woman. Sarah would get frustrated with us not believing her, so she went back to the cars alone this time. We all decided that there was little to no activity happening, so we headed back to the cars. When we got to the cars, Sarah was clearly scared. She told us the woman in the white dress had followed her all the way back to the car. Despite Sarah being scared for the second time, we all still wanted to get to the cemetery. So Sarah said fine, we can go to the cemetery, but I'm not getting out of the car. So we drove up to the cemetery and looked around. But to our confusion, there were no gravestones. A plaque read that 1,487 people are buried in the cemetery. We then had the great idea to use a Ouija board just outside the gate. We could tell that Joey was altering the board. But then he and Anakin looked up and at the cemetery. Joey said, "Do you hear that?" Anakin responded, "Yeah." A second of quiet. I asked, "What is it?" Joey then yells, "Oh shit." And get up and run. Everyone follows suit. I scoop up the Ouija board and run. We all run down through a ditch, and Alex falls. Joey runs back to help her up on her left side. When we get in the cars and take off, we ask what'll happen. Joey said, "You didn't hear those footsteps running at us from the cemetery?" I was then scared a little. Then Alex asked me, "Sam, did you help me up on my right side?" I said no one did besides Joey. She then said she felt a strong force pull her up on her right side. We then met up at the Dairy Queen in town, and Sarah was freaked out again. She said she saw the woman in white in the rearview mirror as she drove away. After that, we all went home. 15 years ago, I lived in a split-level house as a single mom with my 10-year-old daughter. My bedroom was upstairs, hers down. We had a lot of very scary and unexplainable things happen in this house, but the worst was one night when she yelled upstairs to me that she couldn't sleep because there's a dog. I went downstairs thinking the neighbor's dog was barking or something, and as I got closer, I realized I could hear the most terrifying, deep, and loud growling and snarling I'd ever heard in my life right outside her bedroom window. It sounded like a giant animal, not a dog or coyote. I had her run upstairs and I looked outside. The back porch light was on. The noise was so loud, whatever it was, should have been in my face, but there was nothing there. I went to the upstairs deck with a giant flashlight, and again, all outdoor lights were on, and the fenced backyard, which was just grass, no bushes or trees, a 6-foot fence, was brightly lit, and the snarling and slavering noise was coming from right below me, but there was nothing there that I could see. It sounded like a werewolf from a movie, but an invisible one. I went inside with all the doors locked and was terrified that if whatever it was got inside, I had no way to protect us from it. After about an hour it left, and I made plans the next day to move out. Oddly enough, the week after this, the Parks and Wildlife Department was in the valley right next to us trying to figure out what was killing deer but not eating them. Something with teeth and claws was tearing elk apart and leaving their pieces thrown everywhere, but not eating them like a predator would have done. Personally, I think it's whatever I heard that night. I can't describe how terrifying it was. Something in my boyfriend's skin was trying to lure me outside last night. My name is Charlie, I'm a girl, and my boyfriend's name is Ethan. And last night something happened to me that I just can't get out of my mind. It's burned in there, and no matter how much I try and think of something else, it's all I can think about or try to figure out. I'm mostly reaching out to see if anyone on this page or in your video comments might have some answers. So let's preference by saying that I'm very interested in reading and learning when it comes to scary stories, true crime, paranormal things, native folklore, etc. It's interesting, and I like knowing what's out there because I'm a very paranoid person when it comes to things trying to get me. The past year or so I have dove pretty far into learning about Wendigos, skinwalkers, and shapeshifters. Native folklore, if you don't know what they are, I highly encourage you to look them up. Some creepy-ass things. Anyway, me, my boyfriend, and our daughter were living in California this past year. We had just moved into the Mendocino County area, I was pregnant with our second daughter, and on our car rides to and from Nevada to visit family, doctor appointments, ect. We would read each other Navajo stories about these creatures. In these stories and with anything you look up to read about them, it always says to not talk about them or say their names out loud. When you speak their name and start believing in them, is when they come to visit. Or make themselves present and known. It was all fun and games reading these stories honestly. But it never left my mind. And my boyfriend knew that. He has consistently said their names over and over, trying to scare me or just joking and messing with me. But every time it was said, I remembered everything I had read about and got an uneasy feeling. He didn't really believe in these things, I don't think. Until last night, that is. He believes in there being things out there. But I don't think he knows or has much belief as to what the things are. Recently, we moved back to Nevada. I don't know if you've been to Nevada much, but a lot of the state is made up of native land. I don't really know what tribes or anything, but it's everywhere. We moved to an area that isn't so populated and about 30 to 45 minutes at least out of any major town. About 2 hours, I would say, from South Lake Tahoe. Down in the valley. I hadn't really thought about these things in a while. So I didn't know what to think about my encounter last night until I really analyzed what I saw. Yesterday my boyfriend was out with his grandpa, working on his car on another property. I was home and, of course, just watching random scary shit on YouTube. Now, for the sake of the story, let me paint a picture for you of the room. When you walk in, there is a living room with a couch to your left. Above it is a window with no blinds. Outside the window is a deck or patio area. And in front of the couch, of course, is the TV. My boyfriend likes to stay up pretty late. So when he and his grandpa got back, he was just up doing things around the house. I was watching TV and, at some point, fell asleep in the living room. Around midnight, or so I would say, my boyfriend went to take a shower. Of course I didn't know because I was passed out. I then started having the absolute worst dream I've had in a while. Like there was some creepy ass, dark shit happening in the dream. The dream went like this. I was in the house we currently live in, and I was outside with my boyfriend smoking. 3 or 4 cars rolled up and grabbed a man out in the field in front of the house and started torturing him. I ran inside, and after, they started torturing my boyfriend. Doing some kind of ritual where they would make you guess a riddle and torture you with knives and other weapons until you got the answer right or died. He passed. He came in and was then telling me it was my turn now. And then the people started swarming the house. I took the babies and ran into the back room and tried to keep them out. But they got me and one of my babies. I don't normally have nightmares, but when I do, they are so vivid that I never forget them. But this was one of the more sinister ones in a while. It felt like it lasted forever. However, that's not the primary focus of this narrative. What really terrified me is what happened when I woke up. Keep in mind I am sleeping on the couch. But I am turned away from the TV and facing the window. I suddenly wake up, and for some reason things feel different. It's quiet. I can't hear anyone's TV. The only light on is the hallway light. I slowly open my eyes because I hear a tapping on the window. Something my boyfriend does when he wants me to come out on the porch and smoke. It's pitch black outside other than the light from the moon. And the porch is even darker since there is a roof over it. I try and figure out what I'm looking at and who's tapping on the window. I make out what looks like my boyfriend's face. He's tapping on the window and telling me to come outside. And I kind of peek my head up and reassure myself that he's asking me to come outside. I blinked, and his head turned to be facing the same way as mine. He smiled and nodded. I got up to go outside. And when I opened the screen door, no one was there. Now it was normal for him to light a cigarette and go out to the shed in the backyard. But if he asked me to smoke, I would usually just sit on the porch with him, or he would tell me to go out back in the shed with him if he wanted to go out there. But I didn't understand why he would wake me up to smoke. I felt weird and like something wasn't right. So I didn't walk too far out of the house. I just looked around and tried to find him. And when I couldn't, I knew it wasn't right because there was no way that he could have made it to the shed that fast. I went inside and locked the door. And sat back down on the couch. But I still felt like something was wrong. It was too quiet, and he was nowhere to be found. I felt like I was dazed and like something was looking at me because there were no blinds on the window. I decided to go look around the house for him. And when I got to the bathroom, I found out he had been in the shower the whole time. I told him what happened, bawling my eyes out, and he ran outside to look for whoever was out there. But there was no one. We came inside, and we put a blanket over the window. The thing was looking at me through. But I have no idea what that thing was. Why was it wearing my boyfriend's face? Why did it smile at me like that? Did it make me have that awful dream before I woke up and saw it? Why was it trying to lure me outside? How long has it been watching me? How come I was in such a daze? I just did what it said and went outside. His smile was so sinister when I look back and try to remember it. I lived in this farmhouse from 2 to 10 years of age. My mom said ever since we moved there I would tell her every morning that somebody was sitting at the foot of my bed. I don't recall this because I was so young, but I do remember going to sleep in my brother's room across the hall because the shadow man was in my room. One morning my mom woke me up for school and said, "Come on, get up." She went to the shower next to my room, but when I finally went to move, I felt something grab my ankles and a low growl sound. I absolutely just froze and remembered the anxiety I felt and my eyes watering. The feeling let up, and I went to move again very slowly, and it did it again. My mom came in and was mad, saying, "I said you need to get up," to which I replied, "I can't, something is grabbing me." At this point, I was able to get up. I don't know if this was sleep paralysis or not. I also remember we had a cat named Oreo, and she never slept with me, so one night I carried her to my room and shut the door so she had to sleep with me. The minute I sat her down, she ran under the bed and growled so loudly, meowing in distress. She jumped up on the bed on my chest, swatted my face, and bit me, then ran back under the bed, growling. I remember leaping from the bed scared she'd bite my ankles, and when I opened the door, she sprinted out of my room. I didn't think anything of it at the time until I got older. There's so many more stories to that house as well. Me and my brother both saw the shadow man and watched him reach up to the shelf on the wall. On the shelf was a big glass unicorn my mom got from Mexico. He touched it, it fell to the ground and shattered. My parents woke up from it, and we told them the shadow man did it, but they didn't believe us and thought we had done it. We still remember it to this day. Before we inherited the house, my dad's uncle lived there alone. One day he came home and had a heart attack in the front door and fell down the steps and wasn't found until later. My mom also said at night she'd hear a 5-gallon bucket being tossed back and forth in the basement. But the scariest thing is that I reached out to the owners who bought our farm. I asked them if anything unusual happens in the house, and this was the response I received years ago. He said I know at least a few times they have. I don't remember anything specifically besides on time Loren was putting his boy to bed when he was young and Trayton told him there was someone on the doorway and that he hung out up there sometimes when obviously there wasn't. My personal story. I'm usually skeptical of the paranormal, but what happened to me a while ago still haunts me today. This took place between 2005 and 2006 in Elk Grove, California. I was 21 at the time, living on my own in another city. I was visiting friends and decided to stay at my mother's place for a few days. She and my father recently got divorced, so she was living in an apartment complex in an older part of town dubbed Old Elk Grove. Now, this was an apartment complex, nothing scary about it. It had gates at the front, lights everywhere. Anything that went bump in the night was usually attributed to the neighbors having a party. Well, one night in October, it was a particularly quiet night. You could hear the crickets chirping and a low buzz of the street light that was shining amber in the guest bedroom, where I was staying, and cars passing by on the country road. It was my last night there, and after catching up with family conversation, I decided to go to bed. About 2 in the morning, I woke up, or at least I thought I did. Could have been sleep paralysis, I could have still been dreaming, but all I could remember was that I couldn't move. What I also noticed was the sound, or lack thereof, there was none. No crickets, no humming, no traffic. Instead, what I heard was slow breathing. The room itself was fairly large, about 15 by 20, and the guest bed was one of those twin-sized captain's beds with drawers underneath, so there was no gap between the bed and the floor, just a place where you put clothes. The bed was put in the corner, and in the opposite corner, there was also a big armoire, and in the other corner, farthest away from me, by the window, it had a small table with a chair for reading and drinking coffee in the morning. As I'm looking around, with just my eyes, trying to find out where the sound was coming from, it took a lot of strength to lift my head because, remember, it felt like I couldn't move. That's when my heart sank as I saw a dark figure in the corner of the room by the window. Me being a skeptic, and also in an apartment complex, my first reaction was, this is an intruder, but still, I couldn't move. I started thinking to myself, am I still dreaming? Yeah, I've got to be dreaming, there's no sound outside, something's going on. Now, this figure seemed short. I could make out it was female and had robes or a cloak with a veil, but what startled me the most was that she stood up. It startled me because it didn't seem like she was crouching, just short, and the figure grew taller. Like it was being stretched. At that moment, I could feel breath on my ear, I could hear breathing right next to my ear, and again, I was still thinking maybe the AC just kicked on even though it was October, but, directly when I tried to turn my head, the figure rushed me, quick as a snap, and was standing next to me, where the breathing was, and I could tell, it was an old thin woman, very pale, dark eyes, with a black Gothic or Victorian dress on with long sleeves and a neck collar made of lace. She had a shawl and a black veil as well, and she looked about 5 feet, 5 inches. That's when I told myself, okay, it's time to wake up now, because I was terrified at this point, dream or not, I didn't like it, but I didn't wake up. Instead, she extended her leg from under her dress, like it was overextending, and she placed her foot on my chest. The rest of her body followed, as if floating in the air, only to rest on top of me, and she was standing on my chest. As she crouched down, she pressed harder and harder with her feet, like she was increasing in weight. I couldn't breathe. At that moment, I was trying so hard to wake up, to flail my arms, to make any kind of movement, and thankfully, I was able to move my head side to side. I saw her face getting closer and closer to mine, and I noticed her eyes sinking further back into her head, and her mouth was beginning to open with a smile. I finally was able to move my shoulder, then my arms, and my whole body. I quickly sat up as if I woke up, but I didn't remember actually waking up. I just sat up. Everything felt as it was before, but I could now hear the crickets and the cars outside. The lady was gone. I was sitting up, sweating, and at that point, my mom came in the room, asking if I was okay. She said, I heard muffled shouting, "Were you having a nightmare?" I didn't know what to say at that point and just responded, "Yeah, just a weird nightmare. I'm going to watch TV in the living room for a bit. Sorry to wake you." With that, she went back to bed. I went into the living room, I put on a movie, and I fell asleep. This is where it gets interesting. I never brought it up until a family got together in Chico, California, a few months later. Cousins, aunts, uncles, all in a big backyard, having a barbecue. My sister showed up with some friends. She had been away for a while, traveling and living in other cities, so we caught up for a bit. Nearing the end of our talk, I had asked her if she had ever visited our mom recently. She said, "Yeah, why?" I felt kind of dumb as I was about to tell her what happened, but for some reason, I wanted to tell her because she knew I did not believe in ghosts. So, I started the conversation. "Nothing, just something happened. I was in the guest bedroom and said." She stops me and goes, "Did you see the woman in black?" I was frozen, like ice fell on me. I was scared and excited at the same time. So we swapped stories, and they were the same. We both woke up, couldn't move, heard breathing but no sound outside, saw this old woman, and she sat on our chest, couldn't breathe, and finally woke up. It was bizarre that she explained to me the exact same scenario that happened to me. After that, I pretty much forgot about it. Or tried to. Until later that year. It was now August, and my mom moved into a new house, fairly new, a 2-story house where, when you walk in the front double door, the staircase meets you, and it goes straight up. At the top of the stairs was a small area where there was a desk overlooking the backyard, and on the left was a guest room, and on the right was the master bedroom. When you do a 180, there is a hallway with stair banisters on your left, a wall on your right, and when you walk to the end of the hall, a bathroom and another bedroom. Back downstairs, when facing the stairs, the left side was a formal living room in the front of the house, the back of the house was a dining room, to the right of the stairs was the family room, and pretty much the back of the house was a kitchen that led to the backyard. So that's the layout. I say all that because of the strange dream I had when I came to visit my mom in her new house. Again, it's a newer house, no history, I didn't think anything of it. About the dream. I was in the guest bedroom, laying down, watching TV, and I must have dozed off, but that was the weird part, I didn't remember dozing off, it just felt like I went catatonic. The house got quiet, and I couldn't move. I had the same feeling as being back in that apartment. The TV started changing channels and getting scrambled, like snow, it was just static, then it cut to almost like CCTV overlooking my kitchen. It was grainy, and the floor looked warped. But, in the back of the kitchen, I noticed a dark figure, swaying back and forth. I was able to squint my eyes and get a better look at what it was, but then, just like before, the woman in black instantly moved from the back of the kitchen until her face was staring into the camera, but this time, her face looked really old, warped, dry, and decayed, and there were bugs crawling in her hair, and this time, she had no eyes. That's when she turned her head as if she knew where I was and disappeared from the view of the camera. And then I heard the loud thumping, like someone was running around with 30-pound feet. It was erratic. It sounded like there were multiple people running, or she was running on her hands and feet. It stopped for a moment, very briefly, and the silence was broken with the sound of a creak in the stairs. This meant she was coming up the stairs. The problem, my door was open, which also meant I could see out in the hallway and through the banister. I'd be able to see her head as she made her way towards me. I really did not want to see that. I really didn't want to see that. So, I started screaming. In my dream, I could feel and hear myself screaming, "Wake me up! Wake me up!" I heard the steps of the old woman bound faster and faster up the stairs, and sure enough, I see her head and her body, but it was a tangled mess. What I thought was running was her basically rolling her contorted body through the house and up the stairs. This thing managed to get to the foot of the bed, and I saw her hands grip the sheets. I was terrified, I couldn't move, and all I remember was screaming, "Wake me up!" And thankfully, I heard my mom from the other room, "Hey, are you all right?" The moment she said it, the old woman let go of the sheet, sank back down, and, very loudly, stomped and fumbled her way back down the stairs. It was at that moment that my mom walked in the room and said, "You were screaming, what's going on?" All I could say was, "Man, crazy dream. Sorry, it was so bizarre." I looked at her for a moment because she seemed annoyed more than anything, and before I was going to tell her the whole story, she goes, "Hey, did you have a friend over or something? I thought I saw someone go downstairs just now, and they're being really loud." So, that was the second time someone corroborated what I saw, and I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe what she was saying, but she said it. She saw someone go down the stairs. This was no longer my imagination. So, I took her downstairs, and we both saw that no one was there, and her expression went from annoyed to worried. I asked her to sit at the small kitchen table next to the counter. I made some coffee, and I told her the whole story. It was about 5 a.m. I told her how my sister saw the same thing, and after telling her that story, she sat back, took a deep breath, and said, "Yeah, I saw her too, a long time ago, back in the apartment." I didn't say anything because I thought it was just a bad dream. After that, I chose not to think about it. I never did any research about the area. I really didn't want to know, because now I'm too afraid that if I find something, like a story about an old woman and her land, it would make it real. So now, I just pretend that it was just a bad dream, a few bad dreams, that other people experienced, and as strange as that sounds, I really don't want to give, whatever that was, any clout. Maybe it's because I really just don't want to see that lady in black again. This is a true story that happened to me when I was young and in college. I went to UC Davis right out of high school. During my college days, I spent a fair amount of time expanding my mind, if you know what I mean. I had a girlfriend for a few years during this period who I frequently shared such experiences with. One such night occurred in October or early November. A few blocks from her place was the city graveyard. We visited there a few times before in the early morning to watch the sunrise. It was always so peaceful there, nobody would bother us, we could just lay in the grass and take in the pastel colors of the sunrise, fresh morning air, dew-soaked grass, and the sounds of birds awaking at that hour. In fact, for the astronomy classes at school, it was one of the recommended places to go at night to watch the stars. We never heard of any issues here. Back to that night though, it was a new moon and it was raining lightly. We decided it would be fun and interesting to go out for a walk in it. So we ventured out, not intending to go towards the graveyard, but it just happened to be the direction we were headed. Everything was great, we were laughing and joking around down the street, just talking about the absurd things that were going through our minds. Eventually we get to the entry to the graveyard and turn into it. The goofy fun and laughs we were having stopped abruptly after entering. The graveyard has a main, paved road that runs diagonally through it that we were walking on. To the left and right of the road are the graves and large trees shading them. The lights that followed its path were out, and there was no light from the moon, so it was fairly dark out. We were arm in arm with each other as we entered, and as I mentioned, we clammed up within seconds of entering the site. It was very quiet. In my mind, I just had one of those feelings, as if something or someone else was watching us and whatever it was did not welcome us. So I just hushed up, held her close, and whispered to her, "Do you feel that?" She quickly responded with, "Shh." So I shut up, and we just made our way nervously to the other end of the road and exited the graveyard. Although nothing had happened, after we were a decent distance away from the graveyard, my girlfriend brought up my previous query. "Remember what you asked?" "Yeah? Yeah, I felt that too. Like something just did not want us there. Our mood was changed from that walk, we were definitely shook by just that feeling alone. As I mentioned previously, in our times visiting the graveyard, nothing had happened like that, and it had always been a pleasant experience. In fact, I visited the same graveyard a number of times after it with other people, and it was just as peaceful as it was before. So, moving on to the real part of the story, about 3 years after that experience, I had graduated, and it was the summer when I was going to move back home. I was surfing couches for a week while I waited for family to arrive and move to Phoenix. There was a girl from where I was working who had offered me a place to stay for a few nights. I hung out with her during this time. We were out one night, but mostly sober, unlike my previous experience. Neither of us had cars, so we decided to hoof it to a friend's place to visit to see what they were up to. This was on the same side of town the graveyard was at. We stopped by our friends, hung out for a bit, then decided to head back to her place. On the way back, we approached the graveyard. She's fairly new to town, and I ask her, "Hey, have you ever been through the graveyard here?" She says no, so I decide to take us on a slight detour through it. As we enter, I mention that I had been there on several occasions, but tell her the story of my previous experience. Unlike the last time, the roadway through this night is lit, so we were able to see our way through and the surrounding path clearly. By the time I'm done telling the story, we are about halfway down the same path I had walked down with my ex years ago. She responds to the story, "Yeah, it's really weird how sometimes we pick up vibes of being watched like that." No more than maybe 5 seconds after saying this, I hear her gasp and yell, "Oh my God." I turn to her and ask her, "What?" She's turned, looking behind me, so I look as well. There's a man, maybe 5 to 10 feet behind us, following us. Approximately 6'6". Every piece of him is covered in a hooded piece of clothing, so you could not see any of his skin. Face, completely covered by the hood pulled over his face. Arms are covered, hands in his pockets. But definitely following us, and his location and timing are impeccable. I yell, "Whoa! Whoa! 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 What's up? What do you want?" The man stops and replies, in a low, quiet, and creepy voice, "Keep walking." Wah 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 what? Keep walking. I turn to my friend, both her and my eyes are totally bugged out, scared. I was carrying a skateboard, which I had been using on the way there, and the thought of clocking the guy over the head occurred to me. But the fact that I did not know what he had holding in his pockets was a quick deterrent. So we do what he says. We turn and continue walking. She motions to me to book it a few seconds later. I nod and make an exaggerated motion with my skateboard to let her know when to go. She was walking with her bike, BTW. I jump on my board and just bolt. I look back to make sure she's getting away as well. She later told me she also looked back on her way out and saw the man disappear behind a tree. True Paranormal, the demon that has haunted me for 17 years. This story is completely true. Let's start with a little bit of backstory. I am a 26-year-old female who has always had empathic abilities. I can sense energies and emotions that people and spirits give off. I can feel them as strongly as I feel my own emotions. I have been haunted for as long as I can remember, my first memory being at 9 years old. I woke up with a cliché large black shadow standing at the end of my bed, reaching its long, growing fingers out towards me when it attempted to grab me by the leg. I recoiled quickly, pulling my knees up to my chest. I remember feeling a burning pain on my right leg. I ignored it and just closed my eyes tight and forced myself to fall back asleep so morning would come quick. I woke up the next morning relieved that last night's events were just a dream until I saw my leg with 4 long scratches down the length of it. From then on, I was hyper aware of everything around me. This is when I remember my empathic abilities starting. I'm sure they were there all along. This was just the pivotal moment that made me aware of it. I have had a million experiences since this, but I'm just going to tell you of one for now. The one that scares me the most. Fast forward 6 agonizing years later, my father and mother had divorced. When I was 11, my father got custody, remarried, and moved us into a new house. My brother and sister had their own rooms on the main floor, and me and my 2 stepbrothers had bedrooms in the semi-finished basement. Now my father was extremely abusive. He was abusive in every way you can be. I know what you're probably thinking, and yes, even that way, that's a whole other story. So I was extremely depressed all of the time, and I always felt that dark spirit that attached itself to me in that apartment when I was 9, looming over me like a dark cloud feeding on my pain, making it grow into absolute despair. I would hear stomping in the middle of the night above my room and running up and down the stairs over and over, amongst many other experiences. But I was the only one that heard these things, so I didn't bother mentioning it to anyone. As the black sheep, I didn't want to be seen weirder than I already was. About 6 months after we moved in, my father installed light sensors into the hallway of the basement, you know, the ones that will turn the lights on when you walk by and shut off automatically after 3 minutes of no movement. Because we always forgot to turn that light off ourselves. So another year goes by, and the activity I experienced in the house was constant but all the same, so I was pretty used to it. One night I was asleep in the basement, and at 3:03 a.m. I was woken up by light scratching at my door. In my sleepy haze, I thought it might be my little wiener dog trying to get in until I started listening more closely and realized the scratching was up towards the top of the door. There was no way it was the dog. So I assumed my stepsister was messing with me. There was no light coming under my door from the hallway, though. I assume he manually shut it off to freak me out. So I yelled out, "Dan, stop, I'm trying to sleep," and the scratching gets harder and the doorknob starts jiggling, and there's violent banging on the door all at the same time. At this point, I'm terrified, it just keeps getting louder and louder and faster with each stop it I yell out. So I swallow my fear, stand up slowly, and quietly walk to my door, it's still being banged on as I grab the handle. I take a deep breath and quickly open the door. The banging stops, and the automatic light turns on. Nothing was there, no one was there. There was nowhere for anyone to hide and no way that sensor wouldn't have sensed them while they were banging on my door. I quickly close the door and don't sleep for the rest of the night. This happened at 3:03 a.m. without fail for a week straight, then just stopped. I never spoke of it to anyone. A few months later, I have a friend stay the night with me. I wake up, and she's lying next to me with her eyes wide open. I ask her what's wrong, and she tells me nothing, so I just go back to sleep. She goes home and instantly messages me and says she's never staying at my house again and describes what happened and why she was awake. The same violent banging and scratching on the door had woken her but not me. She never came over again. Fast forward another year, I'm 17 and living with my mom now. My brother and sister come over for visitation once a week. My brother had moved into my bedroom in the basement at my father's house. We somehow got onto the subject of ghosts, so I tell them the story of what happened to me in that basement, since I don't care anymore whether they believe me or not. As I'm telling the story, my 16-year-old brother's eyes get big, and he starts sobbing, telling me it happens to him all the time. I have never seen him more scared in my entire life, as he was speaking about that with me, and he's definitely not the type to cry. He was genuinely terrified. Now, I'm 26 years old, and it's getting stronger. I now suffer from sleep paralysis regularly, and I don't think it's a coincidence. That evil thing comes to me in my sleep. I wake up paralyzed with it just standing over me. I fight as hard as I can to move or scream. All that moves are the tears that roll out of my eyes and down my face. I start to panic, and it makes me feel like I'm suffocating. Then I will wake up again, thinking I've woken up from the paralysis only to find out I haven't. And it will happen over and over and over again, like a song that skips midway and starts back at the beginning. You haven't felt fear until you've had sleep paralysis. It feels like being buried alive in a straitjacket, the claustrophobia of a tiny coffin closing in on you, the struggle to breathe under 6 feet of dirt, not to mention that suffocating anxiety of not being able to move or do anything about what's happening to you. Sometimes it will just stand there at the end of my bed, or I will feel it shake the bed violently, or it will pull my blanket off and grip my ankles tightly like it's going to drag me somewhere, but almost all the time I hear it speaking my name over and over and over in a low, raspy, almost growling whisper. I know it's not me just dreaming because when I do wake from it, I still feel it there. Taunting me. Waiting for the day it's strong enough to execute whatever it has planned for me. If you have any suggestions that might help me get rid of it, please let me know. I'm getting desperate. The shadowy figure. The current house I have been living in for the last 21 years used to have signs of a paranormal presence that at least one of my family members encountered at least once, with me having the pleasure to encounter it one night too. So backtracking to the first encounters, the residents of the house were my father and mother, grandma and uncle, and my 2 younger siblings and me. My youngest sibling was around 5 and stayed in my grandma's room because she raised him while my mom worked. My uncle also stayed in that room. My uncle used to hunt for sport, so his guns and ammo were always under his bed. I shared a room with my sister but slept on the floor, and she slept on the bed since she was the girl. The last is my parents' bedroom. It was always a talk during breakfast that supposedly my uncle has seen a shadowy presence in the house, and I would always dismiss it as him trying to scare us since we were young and my grandma superstitious. I would listen to the stories and get a chill but would always dismiss them. One day my grandma joined us at the table for breakfast. Everyone was already eating, and my grandma scolded my younger brother. Something along the lines of why he never came out of the restroom last night after she walked him. He seemed confused. So according to her, He had woken her up in the middle of the night and asked her to walk him to the restroom since he was scared. Half asleep, she got up and walked him and waited for him outside the door, but that he was taking forever, so she walked back to her bed and went to sleep. My brother was confused because he said he never got up, and my mother backed him up, saying that he had slept in her bed last night and never got up. There was a silence, and then everyone broke out in laughter, teasing my grandma that the ghost had gotten her to walk it to the restroom. My grandma got flustered and face red in embarrassment, saying it wasn't funny. I laughed but at the same time thought she could have dreamt it, ever skeptical. The second encounter was with my sister. One night, while I was in deep sleep, I was woken up by her stepping over me so she could exit the room to the restroom. I quickly shut my eyes and fell back to sleep. Morning came, I was eating breakfast, and she looked pissed. That wasn't funny. You must be so delighted thinking you were going to scare me. I was confused, and my mom's asked her what had happened. According to her, she woke up to use the restroom, which I do remember. But after she used it, she was walking back to the room and saw me standing outside the room, waiting to lunge at her and scare her. That she told me to stop, that it wasn't funny, and she looked away for a bit and didn't see me. She thought I quickly went back into the room to feign being asleep. I was so confused, I swore as much as I love scaring others for a good laugh. I didn't get up last night. I did confirm I did see her walk out, but I never got up. She looked at me as if I were lying, and everyone teased her, saying it was the ghost. I asked her if she saw me, she said no, but it was like a shadow, and she assumed it was me. Now I was feeling kind of scared, not so skeptical anymore. A few months had passed, and we all agreed that as long as we didn't bother the ghost, nothing would happen, and maybe it was friendly, like Casper or something. Now it was my turn. My uncle had left the house for the week to go hunting. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling thirsty, so I got up to go to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The way the furniture was arranged made the path from living room to kitchen a bit narrow, so only one person can pass at a time. I bring this up because in front of me, like 10 feet away, there's a figure in my way. I just assume it's my uncle, who also has a habit of getting a glass of water in the middle of the night. So as usual, so we both can get by, I turn and sidestep him to get past him. He does likewise. I go to drink my glass of water and start making my way back to my room. My uncle once again is standing in the way, so I sidestep him. Then it hits me. My uncle isn't home, then who the heck is this? I stop for a moment, my fear just imagines a scary face from a horror movie, a face I don't want to see. This is the shadowy figure? I run to my room as if in a chase sequence and jump in bed under my covers, curled into a ball. My heart was racing, as if this were a threat that would actually stop it. I drift into sleep and wake up wishing it was a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. I get up and go to my parents' room to tell them what I just experienced. They look at me to see if I'm not joking for a moment, and I assure them I wasn't kidding, that I finally had an experience with this ghost or whatever it is. Years pass, and I tell this story to my friends. One of them believes in the paranormal, and he tells me about shadow people, saying that what I could have seen was a shadow person. I take some interest and do some research and conclude it might be because for everyone's encounters we never saw a face but just assumed it was one of our family members. I decide if that's what it is, what can we do, but let it be. As the year goes by, I make friends with someone who supposedly sees paranormal things and whatnot. I'm skeptical in his gift, but after experiences in my house, I believe such stuff exists. One day on July 4th, I invited him over since he was going to be alone, and I felt bad. He takes the bus to my house, and I invite him in. I seat him in the living room and ask if he wants some barbecue so I can get him a plate from outside. As I come back, we go to my room so we can watch TV or video games. As he sits down, he tells me, "Hey, I don't mean to scare you, but there's an old man sitting on your living room couch." My heart skips a beat. I have never told him about my house or what we experienced there. So him seeing a single entity freaks me out. He doesn't mean harm, he just stays in this house. I told him to stop. I explain why it's freaking me out and the encounters we had. He nods and says, "Yeah, all those encounters must have been him." I don't know if Hess messing with me, but I no longer want him in my house. I tell him sorry, but he needs to leave. I get up, and he follows me. "I'm sorry, I don't feel comfortable, and you shouldn't have told me that. Are you scared?" "Kinda, but I think it's better if you left for now." I open the gate, and he walks out. I feel kind of bad, but my fear is greater. He texts me, "Don't feel afraid, or he'll know. Just be calm." I ignore him and decide to stay outside for the remainder of the evening. I never talk to him again, not wanting to be part of that world. The encounters stopped since then, but I'm sure if I ever brought them up to my family, they would remember. If anything, this is the only paranormal experience I would ever have.